What if I told you that in 1894, the US Treasury spent more collecting a tax on playing cards than the tax actually brought in? Or that, for 64 years, federal law banned margarine manufacturers from making their product look like butter, forcing restaurants to serve white margarine alongside illegal yellow packets? Or that President Wilson signed legislation requiring citizens to report the exact number of horses they own to the Department of Agriculture, creating a federal equine census that nobody enforced and everyone ignored? These aren't conspiracy theories. They're buried in the Federal Register, signed by presidents, debated in congressional chambers, and quietly abandoned when they became too expensive or too embarrassing to continue. If you're ready to uncover what was buried, hit subscribe. Get comfortable, pour something warm, dim the lights, and settle in. We're walking through the archives of power tonight. The playing card tax disaster begins quietly. By the summer of 1894, the Treasury Department faced a crisis nobody anticipated. Congress had passed a revenue act that included a 2-cent tax on every deck of playing cards sold in America. On paper, it seemed reasonable. Cards were popular, the tax was small, and collection should have been straightforward. In reality, enforcement became a bureaucratic nightmare. Card manufacturers resisted, retailers ignored the stamps, and consumers bought unmarked decks from street vendors who appeared overnight in every major city. Within 6 months, Treasury inspectors testified before the House Ways and Means Committee that the government was spending 4 cents in enforcement costs for every 2 cents collected. One inspector admitted under oath, "We're losing money faster than people are playing poker." The tax remained on the books for another 71 years, quietly draining resources while producing almost nothing. It was the kind of decision that should have been reversed immediately. Technically, it wasn't. A different kind of absurdity was taking shape. In 1886, the dairy industry convinced Wisconsin's legislature that margarine posed an existential threat to American butter. The problem wasn't health or safety, it was color. Margarine manufacturers had begun adding yellow dye to make their product look like butter, and dairy farmers watched their market share disappear. Senator William Freeman Vilas, who owned substantial dairy holdings, introduced federal legislation requiring margarine to remain white. The Agriculture Committee held hearings where dairy lobbyists testified about consumer confusion and fraudulent imitation. Nobody mentioned that butter itself was often dyed yellow. President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Oleomargarine Act in 1902, expanding Wisconsin's ban nationwide. The law required margarine to be sold in its natural white state, forcing restaurants to keep illegal yellow coloring packets on the side. A black market in butter substitutes flourished immediately. By 1910, federal agents were raiding grocery stores and confiscating margarine that looked suspiciously yellow. The absurdity continued until 1950. 64 years of federal enforcement protecting dairy profits under the guise of food safety. The telegraph pole taxation scheme emerges from desperation. In 1898, the Spanish-American War created urgent revenue needs. Congress passed a War Revenue Act that taxed everything from theater tickets to chewing gum. Buried on page 43 was a provision taxing telegraph companies based on the number of poles they owned. Western Union immediately began lobbying. Their argument was simple. Poles stood on public land, crossed state lines, and belonged to multiple companies simultaneously. How exactly should they be counted? The Treasury Department tried to create a measurement system. Inspectors traveled the country attempting to determine which company owned which poles. After 6 months of confusion, contradictory counts, and telegraph companies claiming poles were decorative rather than functional, the tax was quietly abandoned. The Revenue Act remained law, but enforcement simply stopped. Nobody announced the surrender, it just faded into bureaucratic silence. Now we turn to Lincoln's railroad mistake. During the Civil War in 1864, Congress passed emergency revenue measures to fund the Union war effort. One provision created a luxury tax on sleeping car accommodations. The idea seemed sound. Wealthy travelers paid premium prices for comfortable overnight train berths, so taxing them would generate revenue while appearing to burden only the rich. The legislation included a critical loophole. Railroad companies that owned both the tracks and the sleeping cars were partially exempt. Within weeks, every major railroad reorganized their corporate structure to claim the exemption. The Treasury Department documented the problem in an 1865 report. Millions in anticipated revenue remain uncollected due to definitional ambiguities regarding ownership and operation. The sleeping car tax stayed in the code for decades, but collection never matched projections. It was a perfect example of how quickly industries could outmaneuver well-intentioned legislation. What followed was never reported at the time. In 1913, President Wilson signed the Weeks-McLean Act, which included federal restrictions on importing bird feathers for the fashion industry. The Audubon Society had lobbied intensely, presenting testimony about endangered species and decimated bird populations. The fashion industry, specifically hat manufacturers who relied on exotic plumage, reacted with outrage. Customs officials suddenly faced the task of identifying bird species from imported feathers, many of which had been dyed, processed, or combined. Congressional records show customs agents testifying that they couldn't distinguish between legal and illegal feathers without ornithological expertise they didn't possess. The millinery industry simply switched to synthetic alternatives and feathers from unregulated species. The law remained, enforcement became selective, and the black market in banned plumage continued quietly for years. The next story begins with laughter. In 1917, as America entered World War I, Congress scrambled to fund military mobilization. One senator proposed a federal tax on perfume, arguing that luxury goods should bear war costs. The proposal reached the Senate floor on a Tuesday afternoon in April. The congressional record preserves what happened next: sustained laughter from the gallery, followed by senators openly mocking the idea. Senator Reed of Missouri reportedly said, "If we're taxing perfume, perhaps we should tax poetry and moonlight as well." The bill's sponsor withdrew the amendment the same day. It never reached a vote, but the Treasury Department had already begun printing tax forms. Those forms remained in storage for decades. Physical evidence of legislation that died from ridicule. Finally, the labeling madness arrives. In 1897, Congress attempted to regulate distilled spirits with unprecedented precision. The goal was protecting consumers from mislabeled alcohol. The result was a 47-page regulatory document defining the difference between rectifiers and distillers, establishing labeling requirements so complex that even Treasury Department lawyers couldn't explain them. Distilleries received the new rules and responded with mass confusion. Trade publications published articles with titles like, "What is a rectifier? Nobody knows." The regulations technically remained in force, but enforcement was functionally impossible. Inspectors testified in 1899 that they were approving labels they didn't understand for products they couldn't define. It was regulation as theater, impressive in its complexity, meaningless in its application. The icebox certification nightmare unfolds in 1923. President Coolidge signed legislation creating a federal food safety program that included, almost as an afterthought, certification requirements for household refrigeration units. The Department of Agriculture interpreted this broadly, establishing an icebox inspection and certification program. Inspectors were hired, training protocols developed, and certification stamps produced. The program launched in July 1923. By September, most inspectors had quit. The job required traveling door to door, examining iceboxes in private homes, and issuing compliance certificates for appliances that had no standardized design. Citizens refused to allow inspectors inside. Manufacturers ignored the certification requirement. After one summer, the Agriculture Department quietly transferred inspectors to other duties and stopped issuing stamps. The legislation remained on the books, the program officially active, but nobody ever checked an icebox again. It was abandonment disguised as success. Now comes an exercise in precision. In 1938, FDR signed workplace safety legislation that included specifications for hairnet manufacturing. The goal was protecting factory workers from hair getting caught in machinery. The execution was absurd. The regulations specified hairnet mesh size, material composition, elastic tension, and even the acceptable range of head circumferences the nets must fit. The specifications were so precise, measured in fractions of millimeters, that manufacturers filed lawsuits claiming compliance was geometrically impossible. One manufacturer's attorney argued before a federal judge that the regulations require hairnets to simultaneously be too large and too small. The judge agreed, but the regulations stayed in the Federal Register. Factories began producing hairnets to approximate standards, inspectors began accepting approximate compliance, and everyone pretended the precision mattered. It was theater performed for an audience of lawyers. The banana classification crisis begins with good intentions. During the agricultural recovery programs of 1933, the Roosevelt administration attempted to establish quality standards for imported fruit. Bananas received particular attention. The Department of Agriculture created 9 official banana categories based on size, curvature, color, and ripeness. Category 1 was premium export grade, perfectly yellow, uniformly curved, no blemishes. Category 9 was essentially fit for animal feed. Fruit importers were required to classify all bananas before sale. Nobody used the system. Bananas ripen quickly, change color during shipping, and don't fit neat categories. Importers testified before congressional committees that the 9-grade system was botanically ambitious, but commercially useless. The categories remained official policy, printed in agriculture handbooks, while the actual banana trade ignored them completely. By 1940, even inspectors stopped referencing the grades. What happened next defies belief. In 1895, President Cleveland signed public health legislation that included a federal ban on second-hand denture sales. The concern was legitimate. Used dentures could spread disease. The implementation was impossible. The law required dental professionals to destroy or dispose of extracted dentures rather than reselling them. A black market in second-hand teeth emerged immediately. Congressional testimony from 1897 describes a thriving trade where dental offices sold extracted teeth to manufacturers who sterilized and remounted them. One witness admitted half the dentures in America contain recycled teeth, and enforcement would bankrupt the dental industry. Federal agents attempted raids on dental laboratories, but lacked the expertise to determine which teeth were new and which were secondhand. The ban remained law, violations were universal, and nobody was prosecuted. It was prohibition for teeth. The carrier pigeon licensing fiasco unfolds in wartime. In 1918, concerned about communication security during World War I, President Wilson signed legislation requiring registration of carrier pigeons. The War Department worried that enemy agents might use pigeons for espionage. The law required pigeon owners to obtain federal licenses, maintain logs of where pigeons were sent, and report any suspicious bird activity. Pigeon enthusiasts responded with mass non-compliance. Birds don't follow regulations, can't be easily identified, and often don't return to their owners. The post office, assigned enforcement duties, received thousands of angry letters from hobbyists who called the requirement avian bureaucracy. One postal inspector testified that attempting to license pigeons was like licensing clouds. After 6 months, the licensing requirement was quietly ignored. The law stayed on the books, the forms remained available, but nobody ever asked a pigeon owner for their papers. Now we encounter molasses. In 1930, President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which attempted to classify every imported product for taxation purposes. Molasses became a definitional crisis. Was it a sweetener, a syrup, an industrial input, or a byproduct? The classification determined the tariff rate, which ranged from negligible to prohibitive. Congressional committees spent 6 months debating molasses definitions. The congressional record preserves arguments about sugar content percentages, viscosity measurements, and intended use classifications. Refineries testified that the same molasses could be food grade or industrial, depending on when inspectors arrived. Customs officials admitted they lacked equipment to test molasses viscosity at ports of entry. The debate ended with compromise definitions so complex that nobody understood them. Inspectors made subjective judgments, importers contested them constantly, and molasses classification became a running joke in trade circles. The feather duster restriction appears without warning. The 1922 Tariff Act included provisions protecting American plumage industries and wild bird populations simultaneously. Imported feather dusters, common household cleaning tools, suddenly required certification proving the feathers came from domestically raised birds or non-protected species. Customs officials faced the impossible task of determining bird species from processed feathers attached to wooden handles. One customs agent testified, "We're supposed to identify whether a duster came from a chicken, an ostrich, or an endangered heron. We're not ornithologists." The regulations created chaos at ports. Housewares importers began labeling all feather dusters as synthetic, even when they obviously weren't. Inspectors accepted the fiction because the alternative was examining every duster with scientific precision they didn't possess. The law remained, enforcement became theatrical, and feather dusters kept arriving. Finally, the baby chick postal regulations emerged from crisis. In 1918, the post office began receiving complaints about live baby chicks dying in transit. Hatcheries had begun shipping chicks through the mail to farmers nationwide. The post office implemented regulations requiring specific packaging, ventilation holes, and survival rate guarantees. Hatcheries were required to prove their packaging kept chicks alive during transit, but the post office provided no testing standards. One hatchery owner testified before a postal committee that the regulations assume we can guarantee what happens inside a mailbag we never see. The regulations specified box dimensions, ventilation hole sizes, and maximum transit times, but couldn't account for rough handling, delayed delivery, or temperature extremes. Chicks continued dying, hatcheries kept shipping them, and the post office kept accepting packages that often violated the regulations everyone knew were unenforceable. The yacht measurement wars began in harbors. In 1932, desperate for revenue during the Depression, Congress created a federal luxury tax on yachts exceeding 30 feet in length. The tax rate escalated with boat length. Longer yachts paid exponentially more. Wealthy boat owners responded with immediate creativity. Yacht clubs hired measurement teams to dispute official lengths. Arguments centered on what counted: hull length, overall length, length with or without bowsprits. Harbor inspectors faced owners who claimed their 35-foot yachts were actually 29 feet if measured correctly. One inspector testified before the Senate Finance Committee about a 6-hour dispute over a boat's bowsprit. The owner insisted it was decorative, not functional, therefore shouldn't count. "I had no legal guidance on ornamental versus functional boat parts." The measurement disputes cost more than the tax collected. By 1935, enforcement had become selective. Inspectors measured only the most obvious violations and let dubious measurements slide. Now we turn to the psychic lobby. In 1951, President Truman signed a revenue act that included professional licensing fees for fortune tellers and spiritual advisors. The goal was tracking cash businesses that evaded income tax. The execution created an unexpected problem. Fortune tellers organized. Within months, psychics and spiritual advisors had formed a lobbying group arguing that licensing fees violated religious freedom. Congressional hearings in 1952 featured testimony from self-proclaimed mystics who claimed their predictions were religious practices, not business services. The Treasury Department faced an impossible distinction. How do you separate religious prophecy from commercial fortune-telling? The regulations remained on the books, but enforcement became a nightmare of First Amendment challenges. Most fortune tellers never applied for licenses, and the ears quietly stopped pursuing them. The legislation stayed in the code, technically requiring registration, while the entire industry operated unlicensed. What follows is the pinball crisis. In 1941, FDR signed war revenue legislation that taxed coin-operated machines. The law attempted to distinguish between amusement devices, gambling machines, and vending machines, each taxed at different rates. Pinball machines became definitional chaos. Were they games of skill or games of chance? Hacks. The distinction determined whether operators paid $10 annually or $500. Cities had already banned pinball as gambling, but the federal government needed it classified for taxation. Treasury regulations created a definition based on mechanical complexity. Machines with skill elements were amusement devices. Machines with predominant chance elements were gambling equipment. Inspectors with no gaming expertise were sent to assess mechanical probability in pinball machines. Operators modified machines overnight, adding or removing flippers to change classifications. One inspector admitted in testimony, "We're taxing pinball based on whether we personally think we could win." The dog track taxation puzzle emerges from federalism. In 1934, Congress attempted to regulate and tax greyhound racing betting, which operated in a legal gray area, banned in some states, tolerated in others, regulated nowhere federally. The legislation required dog tracks to obtain federal licenses and pay taxes on betting handle. States immediately protested federal interference. Florida and Arizona, where dog racing thrived, argued that gambling regulation was exclusively state jurisdiction. The federal government insisted taxation was different from regulation. Courts eventually sided with federal taxing authority, but enforcement became impossible. Tracks in states where dog racing was illegal obviously didn't apply for federal licenses. That would be admitting to state crimes. Tracks in states where racing was tolerated claimed they weren't taking bets, just donations or membership fees. The federal licensing system collected almost nothing while creating legal confusion that lasted decades. Now comes customs absurdity. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 required customs appraisers to assess the value of imported fur coats to determine duties. The problem was expertise. Customs agents weren't fur specialists. The regulations required them to distinguish mink from fox from rabbit, assess quality grades, and determine if declared values were accurate. Fashion importers immediately exploited this. One congressional investigation in 1933 found that customs agents were approving valuations that fur industry experts said were obviously fraudulent. A mink coat declared at $50 might be worth $500, but the inspector couldn't tell the difference. The fur industry revolted. Domestic manufacturers couldn't compete with undervalued imports. Customs began hiring fur consultants, which cost more than the additional duties collected. The system remained theoretically rigorous while being practically useless. The radio tube tax attempt arrives with new technology. In 1924, President Coolidge signed legislation attempting to tax vacuum tubes used in radios. The radio industry was exploding, and tubes were essential components. The tax was supposed to track radio ownership indirectly. The problem was complexity. Tubes failed constantly, were replaced frequently, and were used in equipment from home radios to industrial machinery. How do you tax a component that might last a week or a decade? Radio manufacturers mocked the legislation publicly. One trade magazine editorial called it taxing spark plugs to track automobile ownership. Technically feasible, practically insane. The Treasury Department printed tax forms and sent them to tube manufacturers. Nobody complied. After 3 months of zero revenue and mounting mockery, the Treasury Department quietly withdrew enforcement. The legislation was never formally repealed, it just stopped being mentioned. What happened with chewing gum was pure definitional chaos. In 1897, Congress debated tariffs on imported chicle, the tree sap base for chewing gum. Was chicle a food ingredient, a raw material, or a manufactured product? The classification determined the tariff rate. Gum manufacturers testified that chicle was a food component and should face minimal tariffs. Domestic chicle harvesters argued it was a raw industrial material requiring protection. The debate consumed weeks. The congressional record shows senators arguing about whether chewing gum was food or non-food. Spit out the gum. The final compromise classification satisfied nobody and confused everyone. Customs officials at ports had no training in tree sap identification. Importers simply declared chicle under whichever classification had the lowest tariff, and inspectors generally accepted it. The tariff remained law, enforcement remained theatrical. Finally, the pool hall tax arrives. In 1918, Congress added a federal excise tax on billiard tables to war revenue legislation. The tax was $10 per table annually, significant for pool halls operating on thin margins. Pool hall owners protested immediately. They argued that billiard tables were entertainment, not luxury goods, and the tax would destroy working-class recreation. Congress didn't care. They needed revenue. The tax was implemented in July 1918. By December, the Treasury Department reported collecting approximately $40,000 total, far less than anticipated. Pool halls claimed they'd removed tables they hadn't, or that tables were decorative they weren't, or that they were private clubs exempt from the tax they weren't. Enforcement was impossible. Treasury agents couldn't inspect every pool hall in America. The tax stayed on the books until 1965, theoretically active, practically ignored, collecting almost nothing while annoying an entire industry. The Buttering Wars had been raging for decades before anyone admitted what they really were, a 64-year dairy industry victory disguised as consumer protection. Beginning in 1886, dairy lobbyists convinced state legislatures that margarine posed a threat not to health, but to profits. The Oleomargarine Act of 1902 federalized Wisconsin's approach. Margarine must remain white, its natural color, to prevent consumer confusion. By 1920, the absurdity was complete. Restaurants kept illegal yellow coloring packets beside white margarine. Customers added the color themselves. And everyone pretended this protected somebody. Federal agents raided groceries looking for suspiciously yellow spreads. One 1935 Agriculture Department memo complained about the impossibility of determining yellowness thresholds in margarine seizures. State laws piled on. Some required margarine to be dyed pink to make it obviously not butter. The dairy lobby funded enforcement, testified at every legislative challenge, and blocked repeal attempts for 6 decades. By 1948, restaurants began civil disobedience, serving yellow margarine openly and daring authorities to prosecute. The dam finally broke in 1950 when Congress quietly repealed the color restrictions. No celebration, no announcement. The law simply disappeared after 64 years of protecting dairy profits while pretending to protect consumers. Now comes a quieter corruption. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 promised federal oversight of meat processing, but one category received special treatment: horse meat. The legislation included deliberately vague language about equine products, requiring labeling only if horse meat was the predominant ingredient. The loophole was intentional. Congressional testimony from meat industry lobbyists argued that Americans occasionally ate horse during shortages, and overly strict labeling would stigmatize a legitimate food source. The equine industry supported the exemption, worried that horse slaughter would be banned entirely if too much attention was drawn to the practice. The result was predictable. Processed meat products with significant horse content went unlabeled as long as it wasn't the majority ingredient. A 1910 Department of Agriculture report noted complaints about mislabeling, but concluded that definitional ambiguities prevent enforcement action. The loophole remains in federal code today. Horse meat and processed products requires disclosure only under circumstances so narrow that compliance is effectively optional. The coconut oil manipulation unfolds across an ocean. In 1921, Congress debated tariffs on imported coconut oil, used primarily in soap manufacturing. Domestic soap makers wanted high tariffs to protect against cheap Filipino imports. The Philippines, however, was a U.S. territory. The solution was elegant corruption, create a domestic exception for Philippine coconut oil that applied only to certain manufacturers who happened to have lobbied hardest. The tariff legislation included complex provisions about processing methods, territorial versus foreign sourcing, and end-use classifications. One senator from Ohio, whose state dominated domestic soap production, ensured that tariffs applied to foreign coconut oil, while territorial oil faced lower rates, but only if imported by companies meeting specific criteria that favored established firms. Smaller manufacturers testified before the Finance Committee that they were being deliberately excluded from territorial advantages through regulatory complexity. The system stayed in place for decades, enriching connected manufacturers while bankrupting competitors who couldn't navigate the Byzantine classifications. What happened with raisins reveals regulatory capture at its purest. In 1938, California raisin growers convinced the Department of Agriculture to establish federal moisture content specifications for dried fruit. The stated goal was quality control. The actual goal was destroying competition. The regulations required dried fruit to fall within precise moisture ranges. Too dry meant lower weight and profits. Too moist meant spoilage risk. California growers had the climate and equipment to hit the narrow range consistently. Competitors in other states and countries didn't. One USDA inspector later admitted in congressional testimony that the moisture specifications were written by the industry we're supposedly regulating. Imported raisins were rejected at ports for being 0.5% outside acceptable moisture parameters. Domestic competitors couldn't meet the standards without California's specific conditions. By 1945, California controlled 94% of the U.S. raisin market. The regulations had worked exactly as designed, not to protect consumers, but to create a government-enforced monopoly. Now we encounter Vermont's syrup victory. In 1944, Senator George Aiken of Vermont launched a personal crusade to federalize maple syrup grading standards. His argument was, consumer protection. Americans deserved to know if they were buying real maple syrup or corn syrup with maple flavoring. The reality was more calculated. Vermont produced most of America's maple syrup, and federal grading standards would formalize Vermont's existing system while forcing competitors to meet Vermont's preferred definitions. The Agriculture Committee held hearings where maple producers testified about authenticity and traditional methods. What they meant was, our production methods should be the legal standard. The legislation passed, establishing federal grades for maple syrup and requiring anything that wasn't pure maple sap to be labeled pancake syrup or breakfast syrup. Vermont's industry thrived. Competitors who used different production methods or mixed syrups were suddenly selling fake products. The federal standard locked in Vermont's advantage permanently. Fake syrup must announce itself. Real syrup is whatever Vermont does. The mushroom madness arrives with Eisenhower. In 1957, the Department of Agriculture established federal standards for canned mushrooms with 14 official size categories. The stated purpose was consumer clarity. The actual purpose was bureaucratic overreach meeting industry lobbying. The categories ranged from extra small to jumbo, with precise diameter measurements for each grade. One USDA official testified that the standards were necessary because consumers needed reliable size information. Nobody had complained about mushroom size confusion. The mushroom canning industry had requested the standards because detailed classifications created barriers to foreign competition. Countries with different measurement systems struggled to meet the precise specifications. Domestic canners could sort mushrooms exactly. Foreign exporters had to estimate. Customs officials at ports began rejecting canned mushroom imports for classification violations. By 1960, domestic mushroom canners had effectively reduced foreign competition through government-imposed complexity. The 14 categories remained official USDA policy for decades, protecting an industry that had written its own regulatory moat. What follows is geometric protectionism. In 1938, the Maine sardine fishing industry faced competition from Portuguese imports. Maine's congressional delegation introduced legislation establishing federal dimensional requirements for sardine cans. The specifications were remarkably precise: exact length, width, and height in fractional inches. The stated justification was standardization for consumer benefit and efficient shipping. The real reason was simpler. Portuguese sardine cans used metric dimensions that didn't match American specifications. The legislation passed, signed by FDR, and customs officials began rejecting Portuguese sardines for non-standard packaging. One customs inspector testified in 1940 that he was measuring sardine cans with precision instruments to determine millimeter-level violations. Portuguese exporters protested to the State Department, arguing that the dimensional requirements were clearly protectionist. The State Department agreed, but noted that Congress had authority over commerce regulation. Maine's sardine industry thrived while foreign competition faced expensive repackaging requirements. The can dimensions stayed in federal regulations for 30 years, geometric specifications protecting an entire regional industry. Finally, the cheese aging mandate locks in power. In 1949, Wisconsin's dairy industry convinced Congress to establish a 60-day minimum aging requirement for certain cheeses sold across state lines. The public rationale was food safety; aging killed potential bacteria. The private rationale was market control. Wisconsin had the facilities, climate control systems, and generational expertise to age cheese efficiently. Artisan cheesemakers in other states often produced fresh or briefly aged cheeses using different traditions. The 60-day rule effectively banned their products from interstate commerce. One small cheesemaker from Vermont testified before a Senate Agriculture Subcommittee that the requirement has nothing to do with safety and everything to do with Wisconsin blocking competition. The testimony was accurate but irrelevant. Wisconsin's congressional delegation had the votes. The regulation passed, destroying the interstate market for fresh cheese and reinforcing Wisconsin's dominance. Artisan cheesemakers either aged their products to Wisconsin standard, sold only within their home states, or went out of business. Wisconsin's industry expanded, protected by a federal regulation it had written for itself. The Migratory Bird Treaty sounded noble in principle. When President Wilson signed it in 1918, federal law suddenly prohibited hunting songbirds across America. The Audubon Society celebrated. Enforcement, however, proved functionally impossible. Federal game wardens were supposed to patrol millions of acres of wilderness, identify protected bird species by sight, and catch violators in remote areas. The entire federal enforcement budget for the first decade could have hired perhaps 200 wardens for the entire country. Congressional appropriations testimony from 1925 shows Agriculture Department officials admitting they prosecuted 12 people in 7 years. 12. The law prohibited millions of Americans from a traditional practice, threatened serious penalties, and achieved almost no enforcement. Hunters in rural areas ignored the law completely, knowing the odds of encountering a federal warden in the woods were essentially zero. One warden testified before a House committee that he'd personally witnessed hundreds of violations, but could physically prosecute only those foolish enough to hunt beside main roads. The treaty remained law, violations remained universal, and enforcement remained theater. Now the Narcotic Paperwork Rebellion begins. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1919 required doctors to complete detailed federal forms for every prescription involving opiates or cocaine. The forms asked for patient information, medical justification, dosage calculations, and physician attestations. Doctors revolted immediately. The American Medical Association organized resistance, arguing that federal paperwork interfered with medical practice and violated doctor-patient confidentiality. Thousands of physicians simply refused to file the forms. They continued prescribing narcotics and gambling that federal enforcement was too understaffed to audit individual medical practices. They were right. A 1922 Treasury Department report admitted that voluntary compliance is poor, and enforcement resources are insufficient to compel it. The black market in narcotics flourished specifically because legitimate doctors wouldn't participate in the tracking system. Patients who couldn't get legal prescriptions because their doctors refused the paperwork turned to illegal sources. The regulations stayed on the books, compliance remained terrible, and the enforcement gap created the exact black market the law was meant to prevent. What comes next is Prohibition's quiet absurdity. The Volstead Act of 1919 banned alcohol production and sale, but included a critical exemption. Heads of households could produce up to 200 gallons of non-intoxicating cider and fruit juice annually. The exemption was intended for apple cider. It became a home brewing loophole large enough to drive a barrel through. Nobody tracked home fruit juice production. Nobody defined non-intoxicating precisely. Nobody enforced the 200-gallon limit. Millions of American households fermented fruit juice that was obviously wine, and cider that was obviously hard cider, and nobody could prove they'd exceeded 200 gallons because nobody was measuring. One Prohibition Bureau report from 1925 noted with frustration that the home production exemption makes enforcement of commercial bans nearly impossible. Federal agents couldn't enter private homes without warrants, couldn't monitor home production, and couldn't distinguish legal from illegal fermentation. The exemption created a massive blind spot in Prohibition enforcement. The law banned alcohol while simultaneously permitting its home production under a fiction everyone understood and nobody acknowledged. The gold confiscation becomes compliance theater. In 1933, facing banking crises, FDR signed Executive Order 6102 requiring Americans to surrender gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve. Citizens had until May 1 to comply. The order threatened criminal penalties, $10,000 fines, and 10 years imprisonment. The actual compliance rate was abysmal. Most Americans who owned gold simply didn't surrender it. They hid it, moved it to safe deposit boxes, or ignored the order entirely. The Federal Reserve had no mechanism to know who owned gold or how much. Banks couldn't search deposit boxes without cause. Federal agents couldn't search homes without warrants. The government was asking for voluntary surrender while threatening penalties it couldn't enforce. A 1974 congressional investigation conducted after gold ownership was re-legalized estimated that roughly 25% of privately held gold was actually surrendered in 1933. The other 75% stayed hidden. The order remained in force for 41 years, creating millions of technical criminals who were never prosecuted because prosecution was impossible. Now comes wartime rationing chaos. In 1942, the Office of Price Administration implemented tire rationing to preserve rubber for military use. Citizens received stamps allowing purchase of limited new tires. Within weeks, counterfeit stamps flooded the market. The stamps were simple paper documents with minimal security features. Criminal organizations mass-produced fakes. One OPA report from 1943 estimated that counterfeit stamps outnumbered legitimate ones in some regions. Gas station owners couldn't distinguish real from fake stamps. Federal enforcement focused on catching major counterfeiters, but couldn't stop the epidemic of small-scale fraud. By 1944, the OPA quietly abandoned tire rationing earlier than planned, citing supply improvements rather than admitting the system had been overwhelmed by fraud. The rationing structure stayed theoretically in place, but enforcement collapsed under the weight of counterfeiting nobody could control. The sugar ration books follow the same pattern. Also in 1942, households registered for sugar rationing stamps. The system required registration, stamp distribution, and tracking of usage across millions of households. It was administratively impossible. Families claimed more members than they had. People registered at multiple addresses. Stamps were traded, sold, and counterfeited. The black market in sugar exploded. Prices doubled compared to official ration rates. An OPA internal memo from 1943, later obtained by congressional investigators, admitted that enforcement has essentially given up on individual violations and focuses only on large-scale black market operations. Translation: The government stopped trying to police household rationing and concentrated on shutting down major illegal suppliers. The rationing system remained official policy through the war, but household-level enforcement was quietly abandoned. Everyone knew it, nobody announced it, and sugar rationing became voluntary compliance theater. What happened with wool shows industry resistance. In 1943, the OPA established price ceilings on wool to prevent wartime inflation. Ranchers were required to sell wool at set maximum prices regardless of demand. Western ranchers immediately resisted. They couldn't be forced to sell at all. They simply held wool off the market when ceiling prices were too low. Inspectors sent to enforce price controls faced rural communities that protected ranchers. One inspector testified before a Senate committee that he'd been politely told to leave town by a sheriff who sided with local wool producers. Ranchers also found creative compliance. They'd sell wool at ceiling prices but charge separate fees for storage, handling, or cleaning that brought total costs above the ceiling. OPA inspectors understood they were being played, but lacked evidence for prosecution. By 1945, the wool price ceilings were quietly repealed, without announcement. The government surrendered to industry resistance disguised as creative compliance. Finally, rent control evasion becomes an art form. The 1947 Housing and Rent Act, signed by Truman, established rent controls in cities facing housing shortages. Landlords could charge only government-approved rents for existing tenants. Landlords responded with immediate creativity. They began charging separate fees for furniture rental. Tenants had to rent the apartment and rent the furniture at inflated prices. The combined cost exceeded pre-control rents, but technically the apartment rent stayed within limits. Tenants complained, but enforcement was nearly impossible. Housing authorities couldn't prove that furniture rental fees were disguised rent increases rather than legitimate separate charges. One housing official testified in 1949 that landlords have invented 17 different fee categories to circumvent controls, and we can't challenge most of them. Landlords won through complexity. The rent controls remained on the books, technically limiting rent increases, while actual housing costs continued rising through fees the law didn't anticipate. It was a masterclass in regulatory evasion. Comply with the letter of the law while destroying its spirit. The Silver Purchase Act didn't begin in congressional chambers. It began in a private poker room in a Washington hotel in late 1933. Senator Key Pittman of Nevada, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, had spent months lobbying for legislation requiring the federal government to purchase silver. Nevada's mining industry was collapsing, and silver prices had plummeted. Pittman needed votes. Late one evening, he gathered several Western senators and made deals. He'd support their agriculture subsidies if they'd support his silver purchases. The details were worked out over cards and whiskey. One senator's diary, later published, described the evening. Pittman essentially bought our votes with promises of future support. Nobody mentioned Nevada's mining industry directly. We all understood. The legislation passed in 1934, requiring the Treasury to purchase massive quantities of silver until it comprised 1/4 of monetary reserves. The policy devastated China's silver-based currency and contributed to global economic instability, but it saved Nevada's mines. The backroom deal became national policy, and nobody acknowledged the poker room origins until decades later. Now we turn to tobacco's dynasty protection. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938 included tobacco allotment provisions that were supposed to protect small family farmers. The provisions were written in closed-door sessions by Southern Democratic senators, particularly those from North Carolina and Virginia. The allotments granted tobacco growing rights based on historical production. If your family had grown tobacco before 1938, you received a permanent quota. The system was presented as protecting family farms. The reality was creating hereditary property rights. The allotments became valuable assets passed through families like titles of nobility. By 1960, the children and grandchildren of 1938 tobacco farmers controlled the market through inherited quotas. One USTA study from 1965 found that most tobacco quota holders no longer farmed themselves. They rented quotas to others for profit. The family farm protection had become an inherited monopoly. The closed-door session that created it was never officially documented, but participants later admitted the dynasty structure was intentional. They wanted to lock in the existing power structure, and they succeeded for 66 years. The merchant marine subsidy expansion happens over dinner. In 1936, shipping magnates hosted private dinners at Washington hotels for key congressmen. The Merchant Marine Act was being debated, government subsidies for American shipping companies. The industry wanted subsidies without meaningful oversight. According to later testimony from a congressional aide, the legislation's final form was substantially written by shipping industry lawyers and presented to congressmen at these dinners. The critical provision allowed ships to register under flags of convenience, foreign registration for tax purposes while receiving U.S. subsidies. One congressman later wrote in his memoir that he voted for the bill without reading it because the shipping industry representatives explained it during dinner, and it seemed reasonable. The loopholes were intentional, embedded by the industry being regulated, and they've cost taxpayers billions while allowing subsidized shipping companies to avoid taxes through foreign registration. The dinner meetings were never official, never documented in congressional records, but participants acknowledged them years later as the real location where maritime policy was written. What happened with sugar quotas reveals international corruption. The Sugar Act of 1934 established import quotas by country. Cuba received the largest quota, followed by the Philippines and Hawaii. Behind the quotas were months of State Department negotiations that weren't really negotiations. They were bidding wars. State Department cables, declassified decades later, show Caribbean dictators offering payments to American negotiators in exchange for higher quotas. One cable from the Havana embassy noted that Cuban officials are extremely motivated to secure quota increases and have indicated financial willingness to facilitate favorable outcomes. The quotas determined which countries' sugar industries would thrive and which would collapse. Fortunes depended on the numbers. American negotiators accepted consulting fees, gifts, and promised positions with sugar companies after government service. The final quota allocations tracked closely with which countries paid most generously. When one Senate committee investigated in 1960, retired State Department officials testified with careful language about standard diplomatic practices and normal relationship building. The sugar quotas stayed in effect until 2008, enriching countries and individuals who'd paid for access in 1934. Now comes the wool tariff bargaining session. During the 1930 Smoot-Hawley debates, Western senators engaged in explicit log rolling, trading votes for mutual benefit. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah wanted high tariffs on wool to protect Western sheep ranchers. Eastern manufacturing senators wanted low tariffs on imported raw materials. The compromise was worked out in private meetings. High wool tariffs in exchange for Eastern support on other Western priorities. Campaign finance records from the period, analyzed by historians, show Western sheep ranchers associations donating heavily to senators who voted for wool tariffs regardless of their state's interest in sheep. The donations weren't hidden, but their explicit quid pro quo nature wasn't acknowledged publicly. One senator wrote to a ranchers' association, "I have received your generous support and will remember it when the wool tariff is voted upon." The tariff passed, wool prices stayed artificially high, consumers paid more for clothing, and sheep ranchers' campaign donations ensured the tariff remained in place for decades. The cotton acreage payments tell a darker story. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 paid farmers to reduce cotton acreage to raise prices. Plantation owners received the payments, which were calculated based on total acreage taken out of production. Sharecroppers, predominantly black farmers who worked plantation land, were supposed to receive their fair share of the payments. The legislation's language was ambiguous about distribution. Plantation owners interpreted it to mean they received all payments and could choose whether to share. Most didn't share. One USTA inspector testified in 1935 that the payment system is enriching landowners while impoverishing the sharecroppers who actually work the fields. The ambiguity wasn't accidental. Southern senators who wrote the provisions ensured plantation owners controlled distribution. When sharecroppers complained, they were told they'd received their share or were evicted for causing trouble. The USTA received thousands of complaints but took almost no enforcement action. Plantation owners received millions in federal payments, sharecroppers received almost nothing, and the system operated exactly as designed by the senators who represented plantation interests. What follows is peanut aristocracy. In 1949, Georgia's congressional delegation secured permanent federal peanut quotas that functioned like hereditary titles. The quota system limited who could grow peanuts commercially. Only farmers with existing quotas. New farmers couldn't enter the market. The quotas were based on historical production, meaning families that grew peanuts in 1949 controlled the market forever. By 1980, approximately 200 families controlled most of American peanut production through inherited quotas. A 2002 congressional investigation found that quota holders often didn't farm peanuts themselves, they leased quota rights to others for substantial fees. The quota rights were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, separate from land value. One Georgia congressman admitted during reform testimony that the system had created agricultural monarchy, where inherited privilege determines market access. The quota system was finally eliminated in 2002 after 53 years, but only after the government paid quota holders $10.5 billion in buyout compensation. The 200 families who'd controlled the market were paid handsomely for surrendering privileges that should never have been permanent. Finally, the mohair subsidy emerges from Cold War theater. In 1954, Texas ranchers convinced Congress that mohair, the fiber from Angora goats, was essential for military uniforms. The Korean War had created demand for winter uniforms, and mohair was supposedly critical. Congress established subsidies paying ranchers to produce mohair, guaranteeing prices regardless of market demand. The program was presented as national security. The reality was Texas ranchers securing permanent federal income. By 1960, the military had stopped using mohair in uniforms. Synthetic fibers were cheaper and better. The subsidies continued. By 1990, the program was paying Texas ranchers approximately $200 million annually to produce mohair that the military didn't want and the market barely needed. One budget analyst called it the most obviously unnecessary subsidy in federal agriculture policy. The program continued until 1995, 41 years of payments for a product with no military necessity, created by Texas ranchers' lobbying power and protected by their congressional delegation's seniority. The presidential signature became a rubber stamp, and nobody seemed to mind, least of all the presidents themselves. In 1898, President McKinley signed legislation renewing the playing card tax that had been a documented disaster for 4 years. Treasury reports had shown the tax cost more to collect than it generated. Congressional committees had heard testimony about enforcement failures. McKinley signed it anyway. He likely never read the provision. It was buried in a comprehensive revenue act running hundreds of pages. The Treasury Department had to issue a correction notice weeks later because the renewed tax contained a mathematical error in the rate calculation that nobody had caught. McKinley's signature had authorized a tax that was simultaneously unprofitable and incorrectly calculated. When asked about it later, a White House aide admitted the president signs what Congress sends without detailed review of omnibus legislation. The playing card tax continued draining resources for another 67 years, renewed by a signature that represented attention nobody had actually paid. Now we encounter bathroom bureaucracy. In 1912, President Taft signed the Federal Plumbing Safety Act, which included weight regulations for residential bathtubs. The provision was intended to prevent structural damage from overly heavy fixtures. The regulations specified maximum weights for cast iron, steel, and porcelain tubs, along with floor reinforcement requirements. White House staff reportedly laughed when they learned about the bathtub provisions. Taft himself was famously large. and had required a custom bathtub in the White House that almost certainly violated the weight regulations he'd just signed into law. One aide's diary entry noted, "The president has authorized bathtub weight limits while sitting in a bathtub that exceeds them." Nobody mentioned this irony to him. The regulations stayed on the books, unenforced and largely unknown, while the president continued using his oversized custom tub. It was regulation as performance, signed, official, and irrelevant. What comes next reveals inattention as policy. In 1921, President Harding signed a revenue act that included a federal business tax on fortune tellers. The provision appeared on page 847 of the legislation. Harding signed the bill in a public ceremony, praising its revenue generation provisions and economic recovery measures. He mentioned none of the specific provisions. The fortune teller tax went unnoticed for 2 months until a newspaper reporter reading the full legislation discovered it and wrote a satirical article. The press picked up the story, mocking the idea of federal regulation of psychics. The White House was asked whether Harding knew he'd signed fortune teller taxation into law. A press secretary responded that the president supports the legislation as a whole, without addressing whether he'd known about that specific provision. He hadn't. The tax remained law, Harding's signature on it, authorized by a president who learned about it from newspapers weeks after signing. The duck stamp story begins differently. When President Coolidge signed the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act in 1934, he actually knew what he was authorizing. Conservation groups had lobbied for it explicitly. The act required waterfowl hunters to purchase annual federal stamps, with revenue funding wetland preservation. Coolidge supported conservation and signed enthusiastically. What he probably didn't anticipate was that the duck stamp program would become one of the few absurd-sounding laws that actually worked. The stamps generated revenue, hunters complied, wetlands were preserved, and the program continued for 90 years without scandal or failure. By 2024, hunters were still paying, now about $25 annually, for stamps that had become collectibles. It was accidentally good governance, a strange-sounding law that achieved its purpose, remained popular, and survived longer than most serious legislation. Coolidge's signature authorized one of the federal government's rare regulatory successes, though he probably would have been surprised to learn it outlasted most of his other achievements. Now comes agricultural madness. In 1930, President Hoover signed legislation enforcing the 9-category banana import grade system. The Agriculture Department had created the categories. Enforcement required presidential authorization for customs implementation. Hoover signed it as part of broader agricultural recovery efforts. He almost certainly didn't read the banana classification specifics. Fruit companies ignored the grading system from day one, and customs officials lacked training to enforce it. One customs supervisor later testified that we received presidential authorization to enforce banana categories we didn't understand for a purpose nobody could explain. The categories remained official policy for decades while being universally ignored. Hoover's signature had authorized an enforcement system that never enforced anything, but nobody bothered repealing it because nobody remembered it existed. What happened with raisins shows regulatory capture at the presidential level. In 1937, FDR signed legislation creating a federal legal definition for seedless raisins. California grape growers had lobbied for the definition to establish quality standards that happened to match California production methods. The legal definition ran 8 pages, specifying moisture content, sugar levels, size distributions, and processing requirements. FDR signed it along with dozens of other agricultural provisions. Years later, a journalist asked Eleanor Roosevelt whether the president had known he'd signed an 8-page legal definition of seedless raisins. She responded that Franklin signed agricultural legislation, trusting that the Agriculture Department knew what they were doing. The Agriculture Department knew exactly what they were doing, formalizing California's industry preferences into federal law. FDR's signature made it official without presidential awareness of the details. The rabbit fur tariff arrives quietly. In 1948, President Truman signed legislation classifying rabbit fur as a luxury item subject to import tariffs. The hat industry had lobbied for the classification, rabbit fur was used in felt hats, and domestic rabbit farmers wanted protection from cheaper imports. Truman signed the tariff as part of broader trade legislation. He likely never knew about the rabbit fur provisions specifically. One White House staffer later wrote that Truman signed trade bills based on State Department and Commerce Department recommendations, without reviewing every tariff line item. The rabbit fur tariff stayed in effect for decades, protecting an industry the president didn't know he'd protected, through a signature he gave based on trust rather than knowledge. Finally, the saltine standards become law. In 1956, President Eisenhower approved federal quality standards for premium saltine crackers. The baking industry had convinced the Commerce Department that standardization would benefit consumers and interstate commerce. The standards specified cracker dimensions, salt crystal size, perforation patterns, and texture requirements. Eisenhower signed the Commerce Regulation Authorization during a routine afternoon of paperwork. Nobody enforced the saltine standards, bakeries produced crackers however they wanted, and consumers never knew federal specifications existed. But they existed, officially, authorized by presidential signature. When Eisenhower's presidential library later cataloged his signed legislation, staffers reportedly laughed upon discovering he'd authorized federal saltine cracker standards. The standards remained technically active, unenforced. A monument to regulatory theater authorized by presidents who signed what was placed before them. The margarine color ban began collapsing from within. By 1948, restaurants in states with color restrictions started practicing quiet civil disobedience. They served yellow margarine openly, knowing that enforcement was selective and prosecution unlikely. In Iowa, where pink-dyed margarine was required, a restaurant association organized coordinated defiance. Dozens of establishments served normal margarine simultaneously, daring authorities to prosecute them all. State agriculture officials faced a choice: shut down half the restaurants in the state or admit the law was unenforceable. They chose neither, issuing warnings that led to no action. Similar rebellions spread across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. By 1949, a Wisconsin dairy senator quietly admitted in a retirement speech what everyone knew: the margarine color ban was bought and paid for by the dairy lobby. It had nothing to do with consumer protection and everything to do with market control. His confession changed nothing immediately, but it created political cover for repeal. In 1950, Congress quietly removed federal color restrictions. No celebration, no press conference, no acknowledgement of the 64-year mistake. The law simply disappeared from the Federal Register, and margarine could finally be yellow nationwide. State bans lasted longer. Wisconsin survived until 1967, but the federal surrender in 1950 was complete. The dairy industry had lost, not to principle, but to the exhaustion of defending the indefensible. Now comes the tax surrender. In 1965, the ears quietly abandoned playing card tax collection. The tax had been unprofitable since 1894, 71 years of documented failure. Collection costs consistently exceeded revenue. Card manufacturers had developed elaborate evasion schemes. Consumers bought untaxed cards from street vendors. The enforcement infrastructure cost millions while generating thousands. The Ways and Means Committee had heard testimony in 1963 calling it the stupidest revenue attempt in American history. The IRS commissioner agreed, testifying that we recommend elimination as administratively impossible. Congress included repeal in a routine Revenue Act revision. No floor debate, no press coverage, no acknowledgement that the government had spent 7 decades enforcing an unprofitable tax. The playing card tax disappeared from the Federal Register in 1965, removed with the same quiet bureaucratic efficiency that had kept it alive despite constant failure. The tax stamps, the enforcement protocols, the collection infrastructure, all of it simply stopped. Pool halls and card clubs across America never received official notification. The tax died in paperwork, unmourned and largely unnoticed. What happened with gold reveals the compliance lie. In 1974, Congress authorized a review of the 1933 gold confiscation order's effectiveness. The investigation was prompted by legislation relegalizing gold ownership. Investigators wanted to know how much gold was actually confiscated. The findings were embarrassing. Federal Reserve records suggested roughly 25% compliance, meaning 75% of privately held gold had simply been hidden rather than surrendered. The $10,000 fines and 10-year prison sentences had threatened millions of technical criminals who were never prosecuted because they were impossible to identify. Banks couldn't search deposit boxes without cause. Federal agents couldn't search homes without warrants. The government had no registry of gold owners. The whole confiscation program had relied on voluntary compliance backed by threats nobody could enforce. One congressional investigator testified, "We ordered citizens to surrender property we couldn't track, threatened penalties we couldn't prosecute, and claimed success we didn't achieve." In December 1974, President Nixon quietly signed legislation rescinding the confiscation order and re-legalizing gold ownership. The press barely covered it. 41 years of gold prohibition ended with a signature few Americans noticed, admitting a failure the government had never previously acknowledged. The prohibition enforcement collapse was documented as it happened. The Wickersham Commission, appointed in 1929 to study prohibition enforcement, delivered its report in 1931. The findings were devastating. Federal agents had documented approximately 500,000 prohibition violations between 1920 and 1930. They had secured roughly 5,000 convictions, a 1% prosecution rate. The report detailed systematic police corruption, widespread judicial bribery, and enforcement agencies that had essentially surrendered in major cities. One section noted that respect for law has been substantially damaged by laws that cannot be enforced. The commission's investigators interviewed federal agents who admitted accepting bribes, police chiefs who acknowledged ignoring violations, and judges who described their courtrooms as assembly lines for pleading out minor violations, while major criminals go untouched. The report stopped short of recommending repeal, politically impossible in 1931, but its documentation of failure created the foundation for the 21st Amendment's ratification in 1933. Repeal hearings featured law enforcement officials testifying openly about corruption and impossibility. One police commissioner stated, "Prohibition has made criminals of ordinary citizens and enriched actual criminals beyond measure. It is the worst policy failure in American law enforcement history." The 18th Amendment was repealed, and Prohibition ended, acknowledged as a disaster even by those who had initially supported it. Now the narcotic prescription tracking failure emerges. In 1956, a Senate subcommittee held hearings on Harrison Act compliance. Doctors testified about the absurd paperwork requirements and their collective refusal to comply. The American Medical Association submitted data showing that fewer than 30% of physicians were filing the required federal forms for narcotic prescriptions. The other 70% were either not prescribing narcotics at all, leaving patients in pain, or prescribing without filing paperwork and hoping they wouldn't be audited. One doctor testified, "I have a choice between spending hours on federal paperwork for each prescription or providing actual medical care to patients. I choose patient care." The subcommittee heard from Treasury Department officials who admitted the tracking system had failed. The forms that were filed were often incomplete or inaccurate. The forms that weren't filed were impossible to identify. The entire prescription tracking infrastructure had created a black market while failing to track legitimate prescriptions. The system wasn't reformed significantly until the 1970s, 50 years of documented failure before meaningful change. What the OPA admitted in 1946 shocked nobody who'd lived through it. The Office of Price Administration's final report, issued as wartime controls ended, estimated that roughly 20% of the wartime economy had operated through black markets. Sugar, tires, gasoline, meat, clothing, virtually every rationed commodity had thriving illegal markets. The report detailed counterfeit rationing stamps, systematic evasion by merchants, and enforcement abandonment at the household level. One section calculated that black market prices averaged double the official rationed rates, meaning millions of Americans had paid illegal premiums rather than go without. The OPA's own estimates suggested their enforcement had touched perhaps 5% of black market activity. The report's conclusion was diplomatically worded but clear. Wartime rationing had been accepted by citizens as necessary patriotic sacrifice, but compliance had been voluntary and evasion had been universal. The controls had worked primarily because Americans believed in the war effort, not because enforcement was effective. When the war ended and patriotic motivation disappeared, the rationing system collapsed immediately. The OPA dissolved in 1946, its final report a monument to the limits of government control over civilian economic behavior. The merchant marine subsidy fraud comes to light quietly. In 1938, just 2 years after the subsidy program began, the Maritime Commission launched an internal investigation into suspected fraud. What they found was systematic abuse. Shipping companies were claiming subsidies for routes they barely operated, registering ships under flags of convenience to avoid taxes while collecting U.S. subsidies, and falsifying shipping logs to qualify for payments. The investigation documented fake routes, phantom voyages, and shell companies created solely to collect subsidy payments. One investigator's report noted, the subsidy program has become a mechanism for transferring taxpayer funds to shipping companies with minimal oversight and maximum opportunity for fraud. The Maritime Commission recommended prosecution. None occurred. The shipping industry was politically connected, had written significant portions of the subsidy legislation themselves, and maintained close relationships with key congressmen. The investigation resulted in minor administrative reforms and 0 criminal charges. The subsidy program continued, the loopholes remained, and the fraud pattern established in the 1930s persisted for decades. By the 1960s, the subsidy program was costing taxpayers hundreds of millions annually, while allowing companies to avoid taxes through foreign registration, exactly the outcome the 1938 investigation had warned about. Finally, the cotton quota cheating epidemic gets documented. In 1950, USDA inspectors testified before a Senate Agriculture Committee about systematic measurement fraud and cotton acreage reduction payments. Farmers were receiving federal payments for taking land out of cotton production, but inspectors had discovered widespread cheating. Farmers claimed they'd reduced cotton acreage while actually just shifting planting to different fields. They measured their land creatively to maximize payment calculations. They reported reductions that never happened, gambling that inspectors couldn't verify every farm. One USDA inspector testified, "We have the resources to physically verify perhaps 2% of reported acreage reductions." Farmers know this. The fraud is rational, the odds of getting caught are minimal, and penalties are rare. The committee heard estimates that 15-20% of acreage reduction payments were based on false or exaggerated claims. The payment program continued without major reforms. Enforcement remained impossible at scale. Farmers kept gaming the system, and taxpayers kept funding payments for reductions that often never happened. It was the agricultural equivalent of tax evasion, universally practiced, rarely prosecuted, and built into the system's design. The admissions came late, usually in retirement speeches or final testimony, when political consequences no longer mattered. In 1949, a Wisconsin dairy senator delivered his farewell address to a nearly empty chamber. Near the end, he addressed the oleomargarine ban he'd supported for decades. "I will admit now what I could not admit while in office. The margarine color restrictions were purchased by the dairy lobby. We claimed consumer protection. We meant market protection." The congressional record preserved his words, but few noticed. He was retiring, his confession changed no votes, and the dairy industry's power remained intact for another year. It was the kind of honesty that only comes when honesty costs nothing. The senator had spent 30 years defending legislation he knew was corrupt, and his admission arrived only after he'd secured his pension and his political career had ended. It was accountability as theater, performed for history, not for justice. Now we encounter tax policy regret. In 1963, the House Ways and Means Committee held routine hearings on tax code simplification. The playing card tax came up almost accidentally. The Ayers Commissioner testified that the tax had been administratively burdensome and revenue negative for decades. A committee member asked why it hadn't been repealed earlier. The commissioner responded carefully. The tax remained because nobody wanted to be seen as soft on revenue, even when the revenue was imaginary. Another committee member was less diplomatic, calling it the stupidest revenue attempt in American legislative history. The room laughed. The tax was quietly marked for elimination. The admission was recorded but not publicized. Congress had maintained a failing tax for 69 years rather than admit the mistake. And the acknowledgement came only in a hearing room few Americans knew existed. The playing card tax disappeared 2 years later, repealed without fanfare, the failure never officially acknowledged outside that testimony. What comes next is the Great Prohibition admission. The 1933 repeal hearings featured extraordinary testimony from law enforcement officials who'd spent 13 years pretending prohibition could work. Police chiefs testified about systematic corruption in their departments. Federal agents admitted accepting bribes as standard practice. Judges described courtrooms overwhelmed by minor violations while major criminals operated openly. One prohibition agent testified, "We arrested bartenders and left bootlegging empires untouched because the empires had the money to buy protection we couldn't refuse." The hearings were remarkable for their honesty. Law enforcement officials admitting en masse that the policy they'd been enforcing was unenforceable and had corrupted the institutions meant to enforce it. Senator Morris Shepherd, who'd been a prohibition supporter, admitted in the hearings that the experiment has failed catastrophically. The 21st Amendment passed quickly after these admissions. Prohibition was acknowledged as perhaps the greatest policy failure in American legislative history, requiring a constitutional amendment to undo a constitutional amendment. The admission was complete, the failure undeniable, and the lesson apparently unlearned. Future drug prohibition would repeat the same patterns. The sugar quota bribery exposure arrives in 1960. A Senate investigation into agricultural subsidies uncovered State Department cables from the 1934 Sugar Act negotiations. The cables, now declassified, showed Caribbean dictators offering payments to American negotiators for favorable quota allocations. One cable from the Dominican Republic Embassy noted that officials there had made financial arrangements with key negotiators to ensure quota considerations. Another cable referenced customary facilitation payments for quota discussions. The investigation heard testimony from retired State Department officials who described the payments as normal diplomatic practice. One investigator asked directly, "You're saying bribery was normal?" The official responded, "I'm saying the quota system was transactional, and everyone involved understood that." The Senate investigation led to minor reforms, but no prosecutions. The officials involved had retired, the statute of limitations had expired, and proving specific quid pro quo was impossible. The sugar quota system continued for another 48 years, its corrupt origins acknowledged in a Senate report few Americans read. Now comes the wool subsidy confession. In 1993, during deficit reduction debates, a congressman from Wyoming stood to defend wool subsidies. He was shouted down by deficit hawks who called the program rancher welfare. One senator stated bluntly, "We're paying people to raise sheep nobody needs, producing wool nobody wants, protecting an industry that should have died naturally decades ago." Another called it agricultural charity disguised as agricultural policy. The wool subsidy had cost taxpayers hundreds of millions over 6 decades. A General Accounting Office study presented during the debate found that the subsidy exceeded the entire value of the wool industry it was supposedly protecting. The defenders couldn't dispute the numbers. The subsidy was eliminated in the 1993 budget reconciliation. One Wyoming congressman admitted in the floor debate, This program has been indefensible for 30 years. We kept it because nobody wanted to be the one who killed it. It was a rare moment of legislative honesty, an admission that political cowardice, not policy merit, had sustained a useless program for decades. What happened with mohair became legendary. In 1995, Senator Byron Dorgan delivered a floor speech titled Wool and Mohair Madness. He brought props, actual mohair and wool samples, and held them up while explaining that taxpayers were spending $200 million annually subsidizing their production, despite zero military necessity. He read from Pentagon procurement documents showing the military hadn't used mohair in uniforms for 35 years. He quoted Agriculture Department officials who admitted the program serves no current policy purpose. His speech was covered in major newspapers. The absurdity was too perfect to ignore. Yet the mohair subsidy had defenders. Texas senators argued it supported rural ranchers and traditional industries. The debate became farcical. One senator asked if mohair had any current use at all. The response: some sweaters, I suppose. The subsidy was finally killed in the 1995 Farm Bill, 41 years after its creation. Senator Dorgan's speech became famous as an example of congressional waste. But the real lesson was darker. The program had taken 41 years to kill, despite being obviously useless for 35 of those years. Nobody wanted to be first to acknowledge the waste. Finally, the peanut quota confession arrives. In 2002, during Farm Bill debates, agricultural policy experts testified about the peanut quota system. One witness described it as agricultural monarchy, where inherited privilege determines market access. The testimony included data. Approximately 200 families controlled the majority of American peanut production through inherited quotas worth hundreds of thousands of dollars each. These quota holders often didn't farm. They leased the quotas to others for profit. The system had created a hereditary aristocracy in peanut farming. One congressman asked the obvious question, how did we create inheritable property rights in a crop? The answer, from a USDA historian, was direct. Georgia's congressional delegation in 1949 wanted to protect their constituents. They succeeded. The quota system was finally eliminated in the 2002 Farm Bill, but quota holders were compensated $10.5 billion in buyout payments. The federal government paid to eliminate privileges that should never have existed. The confession was complete. The system had been designed to create and protect a peanut dynasty. It had worked exactly as intended, and ending it required billions in compensation to the families who'd benefited for 53 years. The repeals came quietly, buried in omnibus legislation where nobody would notice. In 1965, the billiard table federal excise tax disappeared from the Revenue Code. It wasn't debated, wasn't mentioned in floor speeches, wasn't covered by newspapers. The tax had been collecting roughly $40,000 annually while costing significantly more to administer. The Ways and Means Committee included its elimination in a routine Revenue Act revision spanning hundreds of pages. Pool hall owners were never notified. One trade publication didn't report the repeal until 1967, 2 years after it happened, when an accountant noticed the tax was missing from the updated code. The tax had existed for 47 years, annoyed an entire industry, collected minimal revenue, and vanished without ceremony. Pool halls across America kept expecting tax bills that never came, eventually realizing through absence, rather than announcement that the government had surrendered. Now we turn to the yacht measurement surrender. In 1976, the Treasury Department abandoned the luxury yacht tax enforcement based on length measurements. The system had been administratively impossible, harbor inspectors arguing with owners about bowsprits, measurement disputes lasting hours, enforcement costs exceeding revenue. The tax wasn't repealed, it was restructured. Instead of length-based assessments requiring physical measurement, the tax shifted to sales-based luxury rates. The change appeared in a technical corrections bill. Nobody announced that the government had given up on measuring boats. The old measurement protocols simply stopped being referenced. Harbor inspectors were quietly reassigned. The measurement equipment was stored and forgotten. By 1980, nobody remembered the government had once sent inspectors to measure yachts with precision instruments, while owners argued about what counted as functional length. The abandonment was complete, the failure never acknowledged. What happened with fortune tellers shows bureaucratic entropy. The professional fortune teller licensing requirement, established in 1951, simply expired in 1976. Nobody renewed it, nobody extended it, nobody formally repealed it. The provision had been included in revenue legislation with a 25-year sunset clause that everyone forgot about. Psychics and spiritual advisors had largely ignored the requirement for 25 years. Compliance had been minimal. Enforcement had been non-existent. When the provision expired, nobody noticed. The Ayers didn't issue a statement. Fortune tellers didn't celebrate. The licensing requirement died from neglect, unmourned and largely unknown. It appeared in Ayers manuals until 1978, when an updated manual simply omitted it. One Ayers historian later noted that regulations sometimes end not with decision, but with forgetting. The fortune teller licensing requirement became a perfect example. It existed on paper, was ignored in practice, and disappeared without anyone noticing its absence. The baby chick postal regulations meet a similar fate. In 1982, the Postal Service successfully lobbied for elimination of the live chick shipping regulations. The regulations had been administratively burdensome. Postal workers weren't equipped to evaluate packaging compliance. Enforcement was impossible at mail processing facilities, and violations were universal. The regulations were removed in postal reform legislation that few people read and fewer understood. Hatcheries were never officially notified that the packaging requirements, ventilation specifications, and survival rate guarantees no longer applied. They discovered the change gradually, usually when updated postal manuals appeared without the live chick provisions. One hatchery owner interviewed years later said he didn't realize the regulations had been repealed until 1985, 3 years after repeal, when he asked the postal clerk about compliance forms and was told they didn't exist anymore. The regulations vanished into bureaucratic silence, their 64-year existence erased without acknowledgement. Now comes agricultural cleanup. In 1996, the Department of Agriculture conducted a regulatory review, eliminating outdated provisions from the Federal Register. The 9-category banana import grade system disappeared in this cleanup. The agriculture official conducting the review later testified that the banana grades had been completely ignored by industry for decades and served no purpose. The deletion appeared in the Federal Register as a technical correction. Fruit importers weren't notified. They'd been ignoring the grades since 1933 anyway. One customs official interviewed during the review admitted he'd been approving banana imports for 15 years without ever checking which of the 9 grades they fell into. The grading system was removed from the code in a single-sentence deletion. Section 42.7, regarding banana quality classifications, is hereby removed. 63 years of official banana categorization ended with one sentence in a document few people read. What follows is safety theater dismantled. The hairnet manufacturing size specifications, established in 1938, were removed in 1995 during OSHA modernization. The specifications had been too precise to follow, manufacturers had been sued for compliance impossibility, inspectors had accepted approximate compliance for decades. The OSHA review determined that general safety language was sufficient without fractional millimeter specifications. The detailed requirements were deleted and replaced with general guidance about appropriate head protection. Factories were never notified of the change. Most continued following the old specifications because they'd invested in production systems built around them, and changing would cost more than maintaining the status quo. One safety equipment manufacturer discovered the repeal in 1998 when updating compliance manuals, and realized the specifications they'd been following for 6 decades no longer existed. They kept following them anyway. The regulations were gone, but their effects persisted through industrial inertia. Finally, the Icebox certification program gets memory hold. In 1960, during a Food Safety Agency reorganization and merger, all records of the 1923 Icebox Inspection Program were destroyed. The program had been abandoned after one summer in 1923, but technically remained active in agency manuals. When agencies merged, officials conducting file transfers discovered boxes of Icebox certification stamps, unused inspection forms, and training manuals for a program nobody remembered. One official's memo noted, "We have found extensive documentation of a refrigeration inspection program that appears to have operated briefly in the 1920s. No current staff has knowledge of this program. Rather than investigate or formally terminate the program, officials simply destroyed the files during the merger. The program disappeared from institutional memory. No formal repeal, no announcement, just file boxes sent to destruction." The Icebox certification program had died in 1923, but wasn't buried until 1960, when the evidence of its existence was quietly eliminated during a bureaucratic housecleaning. The duck stamp program survived because it worked. Established in 1934 by President Coolidge, the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act required waterfowl hunters to purchase annual federal stamps. The revenue funded wetland preservation. 90 years later, hunters still pay approximately $25 annually as of 2024. The program has generated over $1 billion for conservation, preserved millions of acres of wetlands, and maintained consistent compliance. The stamps became collectibles, with artists competing for the annual design commission. It's one of the few examples where an odd-sounding law achieved its purpose, remained popular with the regulated population, and survived without scandal. The original absurdity, requiring hunters to buy stamps to hunt birds, became normalized conservation practice. Nobody questions it anymore. The duck stamp is simply what you buy if you hunt waterfowl, and the wetlands it preserves are visible evidence of the program's success. It's the exception that proves the rule. When enforcement is simple, purpose is clear, and benefits are tangible, even strange-sounding laws can work. Now we examine tobacco's hereditary system. The tobacco allotment provisions created in 1938 survived until 2004, 66 years of dynasty farming. The quotas, originally framed as family farm protection, had become valuable property passed through inheritance. By 2000, most quota holders didn't farm tobacco themselves. They leased quotas to others, collecting payments for rights established in 1938 based on their grandparents' farming. The quotas had market value separate from land. Some were worth over $100,000. The system was finally eliminated in the 2004 Farm Bill, but elimination required compensation. The federal government paid tobacco quota holders $10 billion in buyout payments over 10 years. The families who'd benefited from hereditary market control for 66 years were paid handsomely to surrender privileges that should have been temporary. The tobacco allotment program demonstrated how temporary agricultural provisions become permanent entitlements defended by politically powerful constituencies. The quotas survived because they created wealth for specific families who fought to protect that wealth through every congressional challenge. What happened with peanuts follows the same pattern. The peanut quota system, established in 1949, survived until 2002, 53 years of controlled market access. Like tobacco, peanut quotas became inheritable property. Approximately 200 families dominated American peanut production through quotas established based on their ancestors' 1949 farming. The quotas were leased, sold, and inherited like titles of nobility. When the system was finally eliminated in 2002, quota holders received compensation approaching $10.5 billion. One agricultural economist testified during the reform debates that we created agricultural aristocracy and now we're paying them to surrender their crowns. The peanut quotas survived because they concentrated benefits on politically organized constituencies while dispersing costs across millions of consumers who paid slightly higher peanut prices without knowing why. The system was economically indefensible, but politically sustainable for half a century. The maple syrup grading victory becomes permanent. Vermont's 1944 success in federalizing maple syrup standards remains law 80 years later. Real maple syrup can be labeled simply as maple syrup. Everything else must be called pancake syrup, breakfast syrup, or maple-flavored syrup. The federal standard locked in Vermont's production advantages permanently. Vermont still produces the majority of American maple syrup, protected by definitions that favor their traditional methods. The law survived because it created a clear consumer distinction that people understood and appreciated. Real maple syrup costs more, but is labeled honestly. Fake syrup is cheaper, but must announce its fakeness. The standard benefits Vermont's industry while providing information consumers value. It's protectionism that worked by aligning industry benefit with consumer interest. Nobody campaigns to repeal maple syrup grading, because the result, clear labels distinguishing real from fake, serves a purpose beyond industry protection. Now comes sugar's long survival. The sugar quota system, established in 1934, survived until 2008, 74 years of controlled imports. The quotas determined which countries could export how much sugar to America, enriching quota holders and raising domestic sugar prices. The system was sustained by a powerful coalition, domestic sugar producers who benefited from restricted competition, and foreign countries that received quota allocations and wanted to maintain them. The quotas survived decades of free trade advocacy and international trade agreements through sheer political power. Sugar-producing states had influential congressional delegations who blocked reform attempts. The quotas finally expired in 2008, not through repeal, but through non-renewal during trade agreement negotiations. Even then, domestic sugar subsidies and tariffs remained. The quota system had survived 7 decades because concentrated benefits outweighed dispersed costs, consumers paying higher prices, and the beneficiaries had enough political power to prevent reform. The merchant marine subsidies continue indefinitely. Established in 1936, the subsidy program still operates in 2024, providing approximately $3 billion annually to American shipping companies. The flag of convenience loopholes from the 1930s remain largely intact. Companies can register ships in foreign countries to avoid taxes while receiving U.S. subsidies. The program has survived 8 decades despite repeated investigations showing fraud and abuse. The shipping industry maintains powerful lobbying operations and argues subsidies are necessary for national security and maintaining a merchant fleet. Congressional attempts to reform or eliminate the subsidies have failed consistently. Defense Department testimony about commercial shipping needs provides cover for what is essentially a permanent industry subsidy. The program survives because the shipping industry is politically connected, the subsidies are buried in complex maritime policy, and national security rhetoric shields them from serious budget scrutiny. Finally, the premium saltine standards remain technically active. Established in 1956, federal quality specifications for premium saltine crackers are still in the Code of Federal Regulations as of 2024. The specifications detail cracker dimensions, salt crystal patterns, perforation requirements, and texture standards. Nobody enforces them. Cracker manufacturers are largely unaware they exist. Consumers have no idea federal saltine standards are on the books. The standards survived simply because nobody bothered to remove them. They appear in the CFR, taking up pages of regulatory text, specifying cracker characteristics with bureaucratic precision that affects nothing. Its regulation as fossil, preserved in the code, serving no function. Existing because removal requires effort nobody has bothered to expend. The saltine standards are the perfect symbol of regulatory inertia, laws that survive not through enforcement or purpose, but through the simple fact that elimination requires more work than continuation. The pattern becomes unavoidable once you see it. Laws written by the industries they regulate, enforcement designed to fail from the start, complexity a strategy rather than accident. Across 80 years and 99 examples, the same architecture appears repeatedly. In 1938, California raisin growers wrote moisture content specifications that bankrupted their competitors. In 1949, Georgia's congressional delegation created peanut quotas that enriched 200 families for 53 years. In 1936, shipping magnates wrote subsidy legislation at private dinners and embedded loopholes that still cost taxpayers billions. The pattern isn't aberration, it's design. Congressional staff have admitted it openly in testimony. Stakeholder drafting is the polite term for letting industries write the laws meant to regulate them. One staffer testified in 2001 that approximately 26 major agricultural, trade, and commerce regulations between 1920 and 2000 were substantially drafted by industry representatives rather than congressional staff. The practice has a logic. Industries possess technical expertise Congress lacks. They understand their markets better than legislators, and their participation ensures the resulting regulations are practical. The problem is that practical usually means profitable for the drafters. When dairy lobbyists write margarine regulations, butter gets protected. When tobacco farmers write allotment provisions, dynasties get created. When shipping magnates write subsidy rules, loopholes get embedded. The laws serve the writers, not the public interest they claim to protect. Now we see enforcement designed for failure. The playing card tax cost more to collect than it generated from 1894 to 1965, 71 years of documented unprofitability. Why wasn't it repealed? Because repeal requires admitting mistakes, and Congress prefers quiet abandonment to public acknowledgement. The narcotic prescription tracking system achieved roughly 30% physician compliance from 1919 through the 1950s, creating the black market it was meant to prevent. Why wasn't it reformed? Because reform means confronting medical lobby resistance, and ignoring failure is easier than fighting organized opposition. Prohibition's enforcement achieved a 1% conviction rate while corrupting police departments nationwide. Why did it last 13 years? Because the political coalition supporting it was stronger than the evidence against it. The pattern repeats. Create enforcement systems that lack resources, expertise, or legal authority to function, then maintain them for decades despite documented failure. The failure isn't accidental, it's often the point. Impossible enforcement creates selective enforcement, which creates power. When playing card tax inspectors can't check every deck, they check the ones they choose. When narcotic prescription audits can't cover every doctor, they audit whom they target. When prohibition agents can't raid every speakeasy, they raid the ones that don't pay bribes. Enforcement impossibility becomes enforcement discretion, and discretion becomes power. What follows is complexity weaponized. The distilled spirits labeling regulations of 1897 ran 47 pages defining rectifiers versus distillers in language nobody understood. Why such complexity? Because complexity favors those who can afford lawyers to navigate it. The molasses classification debates of 1930 consumed 6 months of congressional time debating viscosity measurements and sugar content percentages. Why such precision? Because precise definitions create opportunities for expensive compliance consulting. The hairnet manufacturing specifications of 1938 required fractional millimeter measurements that manufacturers called geometrically impossible. Why such exactitude? Because impossible standards create barriers to market entry. Complexity isn't a bug. It's a feature. It excludes competitors who can't afford compliance expertise. It creates regulatory moats, protecting established firms. It generates consulting fees for lawyers and lobbyists who understand the Byzantine rules. One regulatory analysis from 2000 found that industries with the most complex federal regulations also had the highest market concentration and the most stable incumbent firms. The complexity keeps new competitors out while appearing neutral. The regulations don't explicitly ban competition. They just make competition prohibitively expensive for anyone who can't hire regulatory specialists. The quiet repeals tell their own story. When the billiard table tax disappeared in 1965, pool hall owners weren't notified. They discovered through absence when expected bills never arrived. When the yacht measurement system was abandoned in 1976, Harbor inspectors were quietly reassigned without explanation. When the fortune teller licensing expired in 1976, nobody renewed it and nobody announced its end. When baby chick postal regulations were repealed in 1982, hatcheries discovered the change years later when they couldn't find the forms. When banana grading categories were deleted in 1996, fruit importers learned about it from updated manuals rather than official notices. The pattern is consistent. Laws are eliminated quietly, buried in omnibus legislation or technical corrections, removed without acknowledgement or announcement. Why? Because loud repeals invite questions about why the law existed in the first place. Quiet elimination allows everyone to pretend the law served a purpose, rather than admitting it was always nonsense. Between 1960 and 2000, approximately 37 absurd or obsolete regulations were removed from federal code through quiet administrative action rather than legislative repeal. Nobody announced the abandonments. Nobody apologized for the wasted decades. Nobody took responsibility for maintaining useless rules. The regulations simply disappeared, erased from the Federal Register as though they'd never existed, their failures unmourned and unacknowledged. Now comes the lobby's long victory. The margarine color ban lasted 64 years because dairy lobbying funded enforcement, testified at every legislative challenge, and blocked repeal attempts through political power. The tobacco allotments lasted 66 years because Southern Democrats controlled key committees and protected their constituents' inherited quotas. The peanut quotas survived 53 years because Georgia's delegation had seniority and blocked reform. The sugar quotas continued 74 years because domestic producers and foreign quota holders formed a coalition defending the system. The merchant marine subsidies persist 90 years because the shipping industry maintains powerful lobbying operations and wraps subsidies in national security rhetoric. The pattern is clear. Concentrated benefits defeat dispersed costs. Industries that profit from regulations organize, lobby, and defend them. Consumers who pay marginally higher prices don't organize opposition because the individual cost is too small to justify the effort. The margarine color ban cost each American perhaps 50 cents annually in higher butter prices. Too little to protest, but enough to enrich dairy farmers who organize politically. The sugar quotas cost each American perhaps $10 annually, invisible to consumers but worth millions to producers who fought for protection. Lobbying wins because intensity beats breadth. 1,000 dairy farmers, who each gain $10,000 from margarine restrictions, will fight harder than 100 million consumers who each lose $1. Democracy responds to organized intensity, not diffuse harm. What emerges as presidential rubber stamping is institutional reality. McKinley signed the playing card tax renewal without reading it. Taft authorized bathtub weight regulations while violating them in his own bathroom. Harding signed fortune teller taxation buried on page 847 and learned about it from newspapers. Hoover enacted banana grade enforcement he never knew about. FDR signed an 8-page legal definition of seedless raisins, trusting the Agriculture Department knew what they were doing. Truman authorized rabbit fur tariffs without reviewing the provision. Eisenhower approved premium saltine standards during routine paperwork sessions. The pattern persists because omnibus legislation is too long to read comprehensively. Presidents sign based on aggregate assessment rather than detailed review. White House staff rely on executive agency recommendations. Nobody has time to examine every provision in 500-page bills. The result is predictable. Industries that draft provisions favorable to themselves get those provisions enacted through presidential signatures given based on general trust rather than specific knowledge. It's not malicious, it's structural. Presidents can't be experts on margarine regulations, banana classifications, and saltine specifications simultaneously. They delegate to agencies, which consult industries, which write provisions serving their interests. The presidential signature makes it official without presidential knowledge, making it deliberate. Finally, the inertia principle reveals itself. Laws stay on the books because removal requires effort nobody wants to expend. The premium saltine standards remain in the Code of Federal Regulations 70 years after enactment despite zero enforcement and universal ignorance. Why? Because removing them requires someone to draft elimination language, justify the removal, process the regulatory change, and publish the revision. That's work. Leaving the regulations on the books requires no work. They sit in the CFAR, taking up space, affecting nothing. Existing because existence is the path of least resistance. The Icebox certification program was memory holed in 1960, not through formal termination, but through file destruction during agency merger. The playing card tax stayed in the Federal Register until 1971, 7 years after collection stopped, because updating the register required bureaucratic action nobody prioritized. The horsemeat labeling loophole remains in the 1906 Meat Inspection Act because closing it would require legislation nobody wants to sponsor for an issue nobody cares about. One legislative council interviewed in 1995 estimated that roughly 15-20% of federal regulatory code consists of obsolete, unenforced, or forgotten provisions that remain because elimination costs more political effort than continuation. The laws stay because inertia wins. They're not defended because they're good, they're defended because changing them is work. They survive not through merit, but through the simple fact that killing them requires someone to care enough to make the effort, and often nobody does. The National Archives at midnight would show you the truth in leather and paper, in mahogany conference tables worn smooth by a century of legislative compromise, in filing cabinets that smell of old ink and institutional memory. The same reading rooms where the Oleomargarine Act was drafted in 1902 still stand on Pennsylvania Avenue, their tall windows looking out over the street where dairy lobbyists once walked with briefcases full of campaign contributions and talking points about consumer protection. The rooms where the Silver Purchase Act was negotiated in 1934 preserve the atmosphere of backroom dealing. You can almost hear Senator Pittman's voice echoing off marble walls, trading votes for Nevada's dying silver mines, promising support for agriculture bills he didn't believe in to secure. Support for mining subsidies he absolutely needed. The conference rooms where Georgia's congressional delegation wrote peanut quota provisions in 1949 are historic landmarks now, preserved exactly as they were, down to the leather chairs and brass desk lamps. These chairs are roped off now, velvet barriers protecting furniture that witnessed the creation of agricultural monarchy. Tourists walk through on guided tours, taking photos of rooms that look like museums of democratic deliberation, never knowing these were the spaces where 200 families secured hereditary control of American peanut production. The poker room in the basement of a Washington hotel where Senator Pittman actually bought votes for silver purchases, cards and whiskey and promises made after midnight, is a historic landmark too, though the plaque outside doesn't mention what transactions occurred there. Tourists take photos of the felt-top table, admiring the period furnishings, unaware that national monetary policy was determined in that room by men who were better at cards than economics. The Federal Register itself, once published on heavy cream-colored paper and mailed in boxes to federal offices and law libraries across the country, is now digitized and searchable online. Millions of pages of regulatory text available to anyone with internet access and the patience to navigate. Government databases. You can find the playing card tax that cost more to collect than it generated, the banana import grades that created 9 categories nobody used, the saltine cracker standards specifying perforation patterns that nobody enforces, the hairnet manufacturing specifications so precise that manufacturers sued claiming geometric impossibility. They're still there, archived in digital perpetuity, laws that once governed commercial activity and now merely exist as historical curiosities, bureaucratic fossils preserved in the Federal Register's endless accumulation. The machinery that produced them is still there too, functioning exactly as it did a century ago. Congressional committees that defer to industry expertise because legislators lack technical knowledge. Presidential signing ceremonies that authorize provisions buried in thousand-page bills that nobody has read completely. Enforcement agencies that lack resources to pursue violations and quietly abandon programs they can't staff. And lobbying firms that draft legislation favoring their clients while testifying as neutral expert witnesses. The specifics change with each generation. New industries replace old ones. Different products get regulated. Modern technologies create novel enforcement challenges. But the underlying architecture remains constant, persistent, seemingly immune to reform or revelation. Now we see the continuity beneath the absurdity. The patterns that repeat across 138 years of American regulatory history with remarkable consistency. In 1886, dairy lobbyists convinced Wisconsin legislators that margarine posed an existential threat to butter, securing state laws requiring margarine to remain white or be dyed pink, making it visually unappealing to consumers who associated yellow with quality. In 2024, industries still write regulatory provisions favorable to their interests, still testify as expert witnesses while lobbying for profitable outcomes, still secure government protection against competition while claiming to advocate for consumer welfare or public safety. In 1894, the Treasury Department began collecting a federal tax on playing cards that cost more in enforcement expenses than it generated in revenue. A fiscal absurdity documented in congressional testimony within 6 months of implementation. In 2024, enforcement agencies still maintain programs they know are ineffective, still produce reports claiming success, while internal documents acknowledge failure, still request budget increases for initiatives that demonstrably don't work, because admitting failure requires political courage. Nobody wants to demonstrate. In 1918, President Wilson signed legislation requiring federal licensing of carrier pigeons for wartime communication security, probably never reading the provision buried in emergency war powers legislation. In 2024, presidents still sign omnibus legislation based on staff recommendations and agency summaries, rather than comprehensive personal review, still authorize provisions they don't know about, still discover from journalists what laws they've enacted. In 1933, FDR issued Executive Order 6102, confiscating privately held gold, threatening massive fines and decade-long prison sentences for noncompliance, achieving an estimated 25% actual surrender rate because the government had no mechanism to identify gold owners or search private property without warrants. In 2024, enforcement still depends on voluntary compliance, backed by threats that sound severe but can't be systematically prosecuted, still relies on citizens obeying laws the government can't actually enforce through surveillance or inspection. In 1949, Georgia's congressional delegation secured permanent federal peanut production quotas that enriched approximately 200 families for 53 years, creating inheritable property rights worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that could be leased to others for profit. In 2024, concentrated interests still secure enormous benefits through political power and legislative persistence, while costs are dispersed across millions of consumers who pay marginally higher prices and never organize effective opposition because individual harm is too small to justify the effort of political action. The names change with technological and economic evolution. Margarine color bans become data privacy regulations. Playing card taxes become cryptocurrency reporting requirements. Carrier pigeon licenses become social media content moderation mandates. Gold confiscation becomes asset reporting rules. Peanut quotas become broadband spectrum allocations, but the underlying patterns persist with disturbing consistency. Industries capture the regulators meant to oversee them. Regulatory complexity favors incumbent firms that can afford compliance specialists. Enforcement fails at scale because governments lack resources for comprehensive oversight. Presidents rubber stamp legislation during signing ceremonies that prioritize political theater over detailed review. Lobbying intensity defeats diffuse consumer interests every time, because small groups with large stakes organize more effectively than large groups with small stakes. Quiet abandonment replaces public repeal, because admitting regulatory failure creates political vulnerability. Inertia sustains the indefensible, because changing laws requires more political effort than maintaining them, even when maintaining them serves no public purpose. What the archives preserve most faithfully is the gap between rhetoric and reality, between the stated purposes of legislation and its actual effects, between the public justifications offered during debate and the private motivations driving legislative action. The Oleomargarine Act of 1902 claimed to protect consumers from fraudulent butter substitutes, its sponsors testifying eloquently about American families deserving honest labeling and pure products. The archive preserves those speeches alongside dairy industry campaign contributions, agriculture committee testimony from lobbyists employed by butter manufacturers, and the private correspondence of legislators who admitted the law was pure protectionism. The duck stamp program established in 1934 claimed revenue generation as its primary purpose, requiring hunters to purchase federal stamps annually. The archive shows it actually achieved wetland conservation, becoming one of American environmental policy's quiet success stories, funded by hunters who embraced the program and made compliance nearly universal. The tobacco allotment provisions of 1938 claimed family farm protection as their animating purpose, Southern Democrats arguing passionately that small farmers needed federal support against corporate agriculture. The archive preserves the reality. Those allotments created hereditary dynasties, where families that farmed tobacco in 1938 controlled market access for 66 years, passing quotas through inheritance like aristocratic titles, leasing them for profit to others who did actual farming. The Merchant Marine Subsidy expansion of 1936 claimed national security justification, supporters arguing that American shipping capacity was vital for defense mobilization. The archive reveals the private dinners where shipping magnates drafted the legislation, embedded flag of convenience loopholes allowing foreign registration while receiving U.S. subsidies, and created a system that still costs taxpayers billions annually, while allowing subsidized companies to avoid American taxes through foreign incorporation. The Peanut Quota Program of 1949 claimed agricultural stability as its purpose, Georgia legislators testifying about the need for orderly markets and predictable farming. The archive exposes the market monarchy it actually established, concentrating production control among 200 families who became agricultural nobility through inherited quotas worth more than the land they supposedly protected. The rhetoric served as a central cover for interests that couldn't be stated openly in democratic deliberation. You can't introduce legislation titled the Dairy Industry Protection Through Margarine Appearance Restrictions Act, or the Creation of Hereditary Peanut Production Privileges for Georgia Families Act, or the Shipping Company Tax Avoidance and Subsidy Collection Enabling Act. You need protective rhetoric that sounds like public interest, consumer safety, family farm preservation, national security preparedness, agricultural market stability, quality standardization, economic recovery, wartime necessity. The Federal Register preserves both layers simultaneously. The stated purposes appear in preambles, explaining legislative intent, while the actual effects emerge in the detailed provisions that follow. Future historians reading these archives will see what contemporary Americans missed or ignored. The stated justifications were often elaborate theater. The actual purposes were usually profit or market control, and the gap between the two represents the space where democracy struggled against organized money and usually lost. The playing card tax appears in Federal Register volumes from 1894 through 1971. 77 years of continuous archival presence for a tax that functioned profitably for perhaps 0 of those years, a revenue measure that cost more to collect than it generated from the moment of implementation. Why does this matter beyond historical curiosity or legislative humor? Because the archive preserves the gap between legal existence and practical effectiveness, between what the law claimed to do and what it actually accomplished. The tax existed in law, properly enacted, presidentially signed, officially published, theoretically enforced. It failed in practice. Treasury inspectors testified to Congress about enforcement costs exceeding revenue within 6 months. Card manufacturers evaded it systematically, Consumers bought untaxed decks from street vendors who appeared overnight, and collection became a documented fiscal absurdity. The Federal Register recorded the existence, the legal text, the implementation regulations, the forms required for compliance, the penalties for violation. The Federal Register did not record the failure. That required reading Treasury Department testimony, congressional committee reports, and agency budget justifications that admitted the program cost more than it collected. Someone reading the Federal Register in 1950, seeing the playing card tax listed among active revenue measures, would encounter what appeared to be legitimate taxation, properly authorized, officially enforced, presumably revenue generating. Only by reading supplementary documents, by following archival threads through multiple repositories, would they discover it was actually a 71-year fiscal absurdity maintained, because nobody wanted to admit the mistake by formally repealing it. The archive tells multiple truths simultaneously, layered across different document types and institutional repositories. The legal truth appears in the Federal Register. The tax existed as valid law. The practical truth appears in Treasury testimony. The tax failed as revenue policy. The institutional truth appears in congressional inaction. The failure didn't lead to repeal, because repeal required acknowledging error. All three truths coexist in the historical record, waiting for someone to notice the contradictions, to read across document types, to reconstruct the gap between law and reality. The playing card tax stayed legally active for 77 years, despite being practically dead for 71 of them, because the archive privileges legal existence over practical effectiveness, because the Federal Register records what laws say rather than whether they work, because institutional inertia makes continuation easier than termination, even when termination would serve the public interest. The margarine color band's archival trail runs from 1886 state legislation through 1902 federal expansion, through 1950 quiet repeal, through 1967 final state-level elimination. 81 years of documentation showing dairy lobby victory, federal enforcement theater, restaurant civil disobedience, and eventual regulatory surrender. The archive preserves every stage. Wisconsin's initial 1886 ban requiring margarine to remain white, protecting dairy farmers from competition with artificially yellowed substitutes. Agriculture Committee hearings where dairy lobbyists testified about consumer confusion while carefully avoiding mention of their financial interests. The 1902 Oleomargarine Act federalizing color restrictions nationwide. Enforcement reports describing federal agents raiding groceries to confiscate suspiciously yellow margarine, state-level escalations where some jurisdictions required margarine to be dyed pink, making it visually repulsive to consumers. Restaurant resistance in the 1940s, when establishments began serving yellow margarine openly. Daring authorities to prosecute every diner in the state, and the quiet 1950 federal repeal, buried in routine agricultural legislation, announced to nobody, covered by no major newspapers. The archive also preserves the Wisconsin dairy senator's extraordinary 1949 retirement confession. Delivered to a nearly empty chamber in his final floor speech, "I will admit now what I could not admit while in office. The margarine color restrictions were purchased by the dairy lobby. We claimed consumer protection. We meant market protection." That admission appears in the congressional record, available to anyone who searches the archives. Acknowledged by almost nobody who should have cared. The senator's confession matters precisely because it's so rare. Most regulatory corruption isn't openly acknowledged even in retirement, even when political consequences have expired, even when honesty costs nothing personally. His admission is archived alongside the laws he supported for 30 years, creating a documentary record of purchased legislation from the purchaser's own mouth. Future researchers can trace the money through campaign finance records, read the testimony through committee reports, find the confession in the congressional record, and reconstruct the corruption with primary source documentation. But contemporary Americans, the ones who paid higher butter prices for 64 years, who accepted color restrictions as legitimate consumer protection, who believed the rhetoric about fighting fraud, never knew about the confession because it was delivered to an empty chamber and wasn't covered by newspapers focused on more dramatic political news. The archive remembers what the public never learned, preserves what journalism never reported, documents what democracy never acknowledged. Now comes the Prohibition record, perhaps the most extensively documented policy failure in American legislative history. The 18th Amendment appears in the Constitution from 1920 to 1933. 13 years of constitutional alcohol prohibition that transformed American crime, corrupted law enforcement, and created organized crime syndicates that persisted for decades after repeal. The Wickersham Commission report from 1931 sits in the National Archives. 11 volumes documenting enforcement failure with devastating specificity, police departments systematically corrupted by bootlegger bribes, court systems overwhelmed by violation cases they couldn't possibly adjudicate, crime syndicates empowered by prohibition profits that funded territorial expansion and political influence, and federal agents who admitted under oath that enforcement was impossible at any budget level Congress might plausibly appropriate. The repeal hearings of 1933 fill additional archival volumes with extraordinary testimony, law enforcement officials admitting they accepted bribes as standard practice, judges describing courtrooms that had become assembly lines for pleading out minor violations while major criminals operated. With impunity, federal prohibition agents confessing that the policy they'd spent 13 years enforcing was fundamentally unenforceable and had corrupted the institutions charged with enforcement. The 21st Amendment repealing prohibition appears in the archival record immediately after these hearings. Constitutional acknowledgement of constitutional failure, America reversing course through the same amendment process that had created the problem. The archive preserves the complete record of democratic error and correction. The idealistic initial ratification driven by temperance movements claiming moral improvement. The documented catastrophe that followed implementation. The honest admissions of comprehensive failure from officials who'd participated in enforcement, and the emergency repeal that acknowledged the experiment had failed catastrophically. It's American democracy at its best and worst simultaneously, capable of making massive mistakes through popular enthusiasm and moral crusading, capable of admitting those mistakes and reversing course when evidence became undeniable, but only after 13 years of crime, corruption, and institutional damage. The Prohibition Archive is unusual precisely because failure was formally acknowledged through constitutional repeal rather than quiet administrative abandonment. Most failed policies just fade away through non-enforcement. The playing card tax stopped being collected but stayed in the Federal Register. The fortune teller licensing expired without renewal. The banana grading categories were deleted in routine regulatory cleanup. Prohibition required constitutional repeal, which required public acknowledgement of disaster, which required honest testimony about corruption and failure. The honesty was forced by constitutional mechanics rather than chosen by political courage. You can't quietly repeal a constitutional amendment. You have to hold hearings and debates and votes that create archival records of what went wrong and why. What the Gold Confiscation Archive reveals is institutional dishonesty spanning 41 years, government claiming success while achieving failure, then finally admitting the failure decades later when everyone involved was safely dead or retired. Executive Order 6102, issued by FDR in April 1933 during banking crisis panic, ordered all Americans to surrender gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1, threatening $10,000 fines, equivalent to roughly $200,000 today, and 10-year federal prison sentences for non-compliance. The Federal Reserve's official reports from 1933-1934, preserved in the National Archives, claim successful compliance and effective confiscation, announcing that the American people had patriotically surrendered their gold to support economic recovery and monetary stabilization. The congressional investigation from 1974, archived 41 years after the original order, tells a completely different story, estimated 25% actual compliance, meaning roughly 75% of privately held gold was simply hidden rather than surrendered, tucked into safe deposit boxes, or buried in backyards, or moved to foreign accounts. The 1933-1934 reports claiming success were either genuinely mistaken, the government had no reliable data about compliance, or deliberately dishonest, claiming victory to avoid admitting the order was unenforceable. The 1974 rescission appears in the Federal Register with President Nixon's signature, quiet elimination of an order that had created millions of technical criminals who were never prosecuted because prosecution was impossible. The archive preserves government claiming success in 1933 while achieving failure, then quietly admitting that failure in 1974 when political consequences had completely expired, when everyone who'd implemented the policy was dead, when everyone who'd evaded it was elderly or deceased, when honesty about the 1933 failure couldn't damage anyone's current political career. The gap between the triumphant 1934 compliance reports and the embarrassed 1974 investigation report tells the real story more clearly than either document alone. The government couldn't enforce what it had ordered because it had no mechanism to identify gold owners, no authority to search private property without individual warrants, no database tracking who owned what precious metals. The government issued threats it couldn't execute, claimed success it hadn't achieved, maintained the fiction for 41 years, and finally admitted the truth only when admitting it was politically safe, because everyone involved was beyond accountability. The We Rationing Archive shows similar patterns of wartime propaganda followed by post-war honesty, public claims of success during crisis followed by private admissions of failure when crisis passed. The Office of Price Administration published regular reports during 1942-1945, claiming effective rationing systems and minimal black market activity, assuring Americans that sacrifices were being honored and cheating was rare. The OPA's final report from 1946, published immediately after the agency dissolved, estimated that roughly 20% of the entire wartime economy had operated through black markets, and acknowledged that enforcement had essentially abandoned household-level compliance in favor of targeting only the largest commercial violations. The archive preserves both claims side by side: wartime propaganda of successful rationing and universal compliance, post-war admission of widespread systematic evasion and enforcement surrender. Why the contradictory records separated by just months? Because wartime required maintaining public morale, the OPA couldn't admit during the war that rationing was failing without undermining home front support, without encouraging additional violations, without suggesting that sacrifice was optional for those willing to pay black market premiums. After the war ended and rationing terminated, honesty became possible because the stakes had lowered dramatically. Admitting that wartime rationing had been widely evaded didn't matter in peacetime when rationing was ending anyway. The archive preserves both the propaganda that supported wartime morale and the truth that emerged when truth-telling no longer carried costs. The documents reveal how governments manage public perception during crisis, claiming success regardless of reality, maintaining optimistic narratives to preserve compliance among those predisposed to follow rules, then admitting failure only after the crisis passes, and admissions can't undermine ongoing policy. The OPA's 1946 final report is remarkably honest about enforcement limitations. Household rationing was essentially voluntary, commercial enforcement was selective, black markets thrived wherever demand exceeded supply, and the rationing system succeeded primarily because most Americans believed in the war effort rather than because enforcement was effective. Finally, the carrier pigeon licensing forms exist in National Archive storage, actual boxes of them from 1918, never distributed, never used, never thrown away, preserved as physical evidence of legislative absurdity meeting bureaucratic permanence. Someone in the War Department carefully filed them in 1918 when carrier pigeon licensing was briefly considered a wartime security measure. Someone moved those boxes during archives reorganizations in the 1920s, 1940s, 1960s, and 1980s. Someone cataloged them in database systems when the archives digitized their holdings. The forms sit there still in climate-controlled storage, waiting for the occasional historian who wants to document that the U.S. government once seriously required federal licenses for birds, complete with registration forms asking for pigeon identification details and flight pattern reporting. The forms are absurd. The entire premise of licensing migratory birds that can't be easily identified and don't respect jurisdictional boundaries was absurd from inception. But their preservation matters beyond humor. They're physical evidence of how democracy can produce nonsense when wartime panic meets bureaucratic impulse meets legislative action. They document that absurdity isn't just rhetorical or theoretical, but was real enough that government resources were expended printing forms, creating filing systems, establishing protocols that were abandoned almost immediately, but never formally terminated. The horse meat labeling loophole remains in the 1906 Meat Inspection Act, still there in the United States Code in 2024, 118 years after enactment, because nobody has bothered closing it, despite periodic attention from journalists and consumer advocates. The archive preserves the loophole's text. The congressional testimony revealing its deliberate vagueness. The meat industry lobbying that ensured horse meat wouldn't require disclosure unless it was the predominant ingredient, and the complete absence of any serious legislative effort to fix it. Across more than a century, the loophole's survival isn't defended with arguments or justified with policy rationale. It simply persists because persistence is the legislative default, and change requires effort that nobody with political power wants to expend on an issue affecting relatively few consumers who mostly don't. No, horse meat labeling is optional. The laws themselves change. Margarine can be yellow now without legal penalty. Playing cards aren't federally taxed. Gold ownership is legal and unrestricted. Prohibition was repealed by constitutional amendment. Mohair subsidies were finally eliminated after 41 years. But the machinery that produced those laws doesn't change at all. Industries still write the regulations meant to govern them, submitting draft language to sympathetic committee chairmen and testifying as neutral experts while lobbying for profitable outcomes. Enforcement still fails at scale because governments lack resources for comprehensive oversight, and enforcement impossibility creates selective enforcement that becomes discretionary power. Presidents still sign legislation based on comprehensive briefings rather than comprehensive reading, authorizing provisions they don't know about in bills they haven't read. Lobbying intensity still defeats diffuse consumer opposition every single time because small groups with enormous stakes organize more effectively than large groups with trivial individual stakes. Regulatory complexity still favors incumbent firms that can afford compliance specialists and lawyers who can navigate Byzantine requirements. Quiet administrative abandonment still replaces public legislative repeal because admitting regulatory failure creates political vulnerability nobody wants to accept. Inertia still sustains the indefensible because changing laws requires political effort while maintaining them requires nothing, even when maintaining them serves no public purpose and continuing them serves only the private interests that wrote them originally. The Federal Register still grows relentlessly, adding new regulations faster than it removes old ones, preserving law that nobody enforces alongside law that everyone follows, maintaining distinctions that matter enormously to affected industries and not at all to the general public. The archive expands every year, documenting both democracy's occasional capacity for self-correction, prohibition was repealed, margarine can be yellow, mohair subsidies ended, and its persistent tendency toward regulatory capture where industries control the agencies meant to regulate them. The archive preserves both democracy's honest moments, the Wickersham Commission's devastating prohibition report, the Wisconsin senator's retirement confession about dairy lobby corruption, the 1974 gold confiscation investigation admitting failure, and its decades of institutional dishonesty where agencies claim success, while internal documents acknowledge failure. The archive documents both the laws that work, like the duck stamp program that accidentally achieved conservation while claiming revenue generation, and the 99 examples we've examined tonight of laws that were always partially or completely absurd, maintained for decades despite documented dysfunction, defended by political interests rather than policy merit. The archive shows democracy capable of spectacular error, constitutional prohibition, gold confiscation that achieved 25% compliance, 64 years of margarine color restrictions bought by dairy lobbies, 53 years of peanut quotas enriching 200 families. The archive also shows democracy capable of eventual correction, repealing prohibition, ending margarine bans, eliminating peanut quotas, though often only after decades of documented failure, and only after compensating the beneficiaries of bad policy with billions in buyout payments. What the archive demonstrates most clearly is that democratic self-correction happens slowly, incompletely, and usually only when organized interests supporting bad policy finally lose political power, or when maintaining the fiction becomes more expensive than admitting the failure. The reading room is quiet at midnight, fluorescent lights humming softly over mahogany tables where researchers examine documents most Americans don't know exist. The leather chairs where senators and lobbyists drafted legislation are preserved behind velvet ropes. Museum pieces now, their original purposes obscured by time and by plaques that describe democratic deliberation without mentioning the deals that occurred there. The Federal Register is digitized and searchable. Millions of pages available online to anyone with patience and interest, though almost nobody searches it except lawyers billing by the hour and compliance officers trying to understand requirements their companies must follow. The poker rooms where actual legislative bargains were struck are historic landmarks with brass plaques that mention important political discussions, without specifying that national monetary policy was determined by men playing cards and making deals that served Nevada's mining industry, rather than national economic interests. The congressional hearing rooms still host testimony. Witnesses still swear oaths to tell the truth. Industries still testify as neutral experts while lobbying for profitable outcomes. And the testimony is still recorded and archived for future historians to examine and reconstruct what actually happened versus what was publicly claimed. The White House still hosts signing ceremonies where presidents stand before cameras and sign legislation they haven't read completely, surrounded by supporters celebrating bills whose specific provisions were written by the industries they regulate. The enforcement agencies still produce reports claiming program success, while internal documents acknowledge enforcement failure, still request budget increases for initiatives that don't work, still maintain programs they know are ineffective, because admitting failure would threaten funding and bureaucratic survival. The lobbyists still draft legislation in law firm conference rooms, still testify before congressional committees, still make campaign contributions that ensure their drafted language becomes federal law. The archives still preserve everything with bureaucratic indifference to content, the good intentions and the corrupt purposes, the honest testimony and the deliberate lies, the enforcement successes and the enforcement failures, the loud legislative debates and the quiet administrative repeals, the rare public confessions and the persistent institutional silence about how power actually works and whose interests it actually serves. Rest easy knowing every absurdity we've examined tonight was properly signed, officially sealed, and carefully filed in archives where it will outlast all of us. The archives preserve it all with equal diligence. The playing card tax that cost more to collect than it generated for 71 years. The margarine color ban that dairy lobbies bought to eliminate competition for 64 years. The peanut quotas that enriched exactly 200 Georgia families for 53 years. The mohair subsidies that continued 41 years after any military necessity ended. The premium saltine cracker standards that remained technically active despite affecting absolutely nothing and being known to virtually nobody. The duck stamp program that accidentally worked. The prohibition disaster that required constitutional repeal. The gold confiscation that achieved 25% compliance while claiming complete success. The rationing that maintained public morale through optimistic lies followed by honest post-war admissions. The carrier pigeon licensing forms still sitting in boxes, never used, never discarded. The horse meat labeling loophole still open after 118 years, because closing it requires effort nobody wants to expend. Tomorrow morning, when Washington wakes and Congress reconvenes and committee hearings resume, someone will draft another regulation that will sound perfectly reasonable in public debate, will serve concentrated private interests rather than diffuse public welfare, will fail in practice while succeeding in law, and will survive for decades through political protection and institutional inertia long after everyone involved has retired or died. The machinery continues operating exactly as it has for 138 years. The Federal Register grows, adding regulations faster than removing them, preserving the active and the obsolete in digital perpetuity. The archives expand, documenting today's decisions for historians who will examine them decades from now and wonder why obvious absurdities persisted so long. And somewhere in Washington tonight, in a leather chair in a congressional office or a hotel dining room where lobbyists meet sympathetic legislators, someone is drafting the next provision that will embed industry preferences into federal law, that will sound like public interest while serving private profit, that will create complexity favoring incumbents, that will fail enforcement tests while passing political ones, and that will survive far longer than merit would justify, because inertia sustains what political power protects. The specific laws change as industries and technologies and political coalitions evolve. The fundamental machinery producing those laws doesn't change at all. It persists, preserved in the archives, functioning in the present, ready to produce tomorrow's absurdities with the same reliable efficiency it demonstrated producing yesterday's. The laws change. The machinery doesn't. Sleep well.